in the sweltering midsummer nights of 1760, while the grand courts of Versailles indulged in the ultimate extravagance of scented leather and rare floral waters. The true architecture of that luxury was being forged by the silent hands of apprentices within the stone laboratories of Grasses. Here, the meticulous capture of the fleeting essence of jasmine blossoms through the method of cold enfleurage was far from a romantic endeavour, serving instead as an economic lifeline born from oppressive royal taxation that forced a rough medieval tanning town to redefine its destiny. It was a realm where ancient chemical traditions and tireless human patience converged under the dim flicker of candlelight, quietly establishing the foundations of the global fragrance trade that would endure for centuries to come. Hello, my dear friend. I'm so glad you have guided your steps to this quiet corner of the evening to step back in time of the past and seek refuge in the gentle rhythm of the past. Let the heavy burdens and frantic pace of your day dissolve completely as you settle into your space. Take a moment to adjust your pillow so that your neck is fully supported, and pull your blanket a little closer to find that perfect sense of warmth and security. You are entirely safe here, far removed from the constant noise and digital distractions of the modern world. As we prepare to let the soothing flow of history carry us away, let us now cross the boundary of time and place ourselves precisely on the night of July 14th, 1760, within the dark and quiet interior of a perfume laboratory in Grasse. This town is situated precariously on the steep limestone slopes of the Provence region, where the rugged cliffs look out the Mediterranean Sea toward the distant horizon of the Mediterranean Sea. The walls of the workshop around us are built from thick blocks of local stone, measuring more than 2 feet in width, a deliberate design choice meant to insulate the room against the intense heat of the southern French summer. Maintaining a cool, unchanging temperature within these walls is a matter of absolute necessity, as any sudden warmth would ruin spread across the glass frames. Bien des Glanimals frame. In this era, Grasse is transitioning away from its historical identity as a major centre for the leather tanning trade, an industry that had dominated the town since the 12th century, but left the streets thick with the unpleasant odours of raw hides and industrial lime. When the heavy tax burdens imposed during the reign of Louis XIV crippled the leather market, the local artisans turned toward their environment for survival. Local party, recognizing that the unique microclimate of the valley offered an unparalleled advantage, protected from the harsh northern winds by the maritime Alps and nourished by the humid coastal air, the soil of Grasse became the ideal nursery for aromatic flora, particularly the delicate royal jasmine introduced by Spanish traders. The legal framework of this burgeoning industry was solidified in 1724 that officially recognized the Guild of Master Glove Makers and Perfumers, granting them independence from the tanners and implementing strict operational codes. Every recipe, distillation technique, and trade secret was fiercely guarded under guild law, transforming the town into a repository of specialized botanical knowledge. As an apprentice working within this system represents the fulfillment of a demanding contractual obligation that requires years of unpaid, disciplined labor. Samite, where guild regulations dictate that an apprentice must spend between 3 and 7 years performing the most repetitive and exhausting tasks, learning to read the subtle changes in weather, grease consistency, and floral quality before ever earning the title of journeyman. As we observe the apprentice prepare his workbench for the long night ahead, remember that this historical is constructed historical narrative, constructed solely for entertainment, relaxation, and educational purposes. While our journey is firmly rooted in verified historical archives and economic realities of the 18th century, certain scenes and atmospheric details have been textually reimagined to provide an immersive and deeply soothing auditory experience for your night. The separation of the guilds was not merely a matter of prestige, but a strict legal boundary that completely reshaped the economic landscape of Grasse. Under the landmark royal decree of 1724, the newly formed Guild of Master Perfumers established absolute control over the cultivation and processing of all aromatic plants within the region. This legal document dictated that no individual of scent extraction or sell scented goods without first passing a rigorous examination conducted by a Bear Council of Elected Guild, a Council of Elected Guild Masters. The decree drew a firm and permanent line between the old leather workers and the new creators of fragrance. Tanners were legally restricted to the raw and heavy tasks of curing hides, while the perfumers claimed exclusive rights to the delicate processes of refinement, maceration, and scenting. This legal division meant that the laboratory where the apprentice stood tonight was a space protected by royal authority, where every vessel, every formula, mean, comfortable, and every method was subject to the watchful eyes of state inspectors who possessed the power to seize unauthorized materials and levy heavy fines on non-compliant workshops. The physical space of the laboratory reflected this need for absolute control, isolation, and environmental stability. Situated in the lower level of a sturdy stone structure built into the hillside, the room featured vaulted ceilings constructed from dense limestone sound and stabilized the internal temperature against the summer heat. Sounds. The floor was made of wide slabs of local slate, meticulously swept clean of any dust or debris that could contaminate the pure animal fats used in the enfleurage process. In the center of the room stood a massive workbench crafted from seasoned oak, its dark surface worn smooth and careful scraping with metal tools. To the left, a series of narrow shelves held ceramic jars, heavy iron mortars, and glass vials of various sizes. The single high window was fitted with thick wooden shutters, tightly barred against the night air to prevent the gentle mountain breeze from disturbing the delicate equilibrium of the room. This enclosed environment created an atmosphere of profound stillness, where the outside world seemed to fade away completely, leaving only the steady flicker of the tallow candle casting long shadows across the heavy masonry walls. Within this silent chamber, the apprentice was bound by the legal and social realities of his indentured service to the master perfumer. The guild regulations required that he maintain perfect order in the workshop, preparing the necessary tools and raw materials long before the master arrived to supervise the final blending of the fragrances. The legal contract signed by the family of the apprentice stipulated that he must protect the secrets of the workshop under threat of severe financial penalties and permanent expulsion from the trade. In kind, this meant that every action taken during the quiet night hours was executed with a deep sense of responsibility and extreme caution. The tools arranged on the oak table were specific to the requirements of the 1724 decree, which regulated even the types of metal permitted. In the preparation of elite cosmetics, iron and copper vessels were carefully monitored, as their reactivity could easily spoil the purity of the delicate pomades that the French aristocracy demanded, forcing the apprentice to rely on specialized utensils made of silver, glass, or polished bone. The unique geographic positioning of the Grasse Valley provided the essential natural foundation that allowed the perfume economic tides of the 18th, despite the shifting economic century, Nestled securely in the foothills of the maritime Alps, the town was perfectly shielded from the fierce northern winds, known as the Mistral, which frequently chilled the lower plains of Provence and destroyed sensitive crops. Instead, the amphitheatre-shaped valley caught the warm, moisture-laden currents blowing inland from the Mediterranean Sea, creating an isolated microclimate where frosts were rare and the summer heat was tempered by gentle evening breezes. The soil itself, composed of rich limestone and clay layers, retained water efficiently from the winter rains, allowing deep-rooted plants to survive the dry summer months without artificial irrigation. This perfect harmony of terrain, temperature, and moisture made the valley an agricultural anomaly, uniquely suited for cultivating the delicate botanical species that would soon replace leather as the true wealth of Grasse. Central to this botanical revolution was the cultivation of the royal jasmine, known as Jasminum grandiflorum, a plant whose history was woven with the threads of global maritime exploration. Originally native to the warmer regions of Asia, this specific variety was brought to the ports of southern Europe by Spanish navigators during the 17th century. When it first arrived in Grasse, local farmers the delicate exotic with grafting hardy a wild yellow jasmine that grew naturally along the stone walls of the valley. This agricultural breakthrough resulted in a resilient plant that could withstand the occasional cold nights of Provence, while producing blossoms of unparalleled aromatic intensity. By 1760, the cultivation of royal jasmine had become a highly specialized discipline, with vast fields stretching across the terraced hillsides surrounding the town, transforming the local agricultural economy and tying the destiny of humble French peasants to the luxury markets of distant capital cities. As you listen to the steady rhythm of this historical journey and imagine the quiet fields of jasmine resting under the starlight of 1760, you are invited to let your mind drift deeper into a state of absolute relaxation. If you find comfort in these whispers of the past, please take a moment to gently support our sanctuaries by subscribing to Whispers of Centuries, ensuring that you can always find your way back to this peaceful space whenever you need to rest. Your quiet presence here is deeply appreciated, and as the narrative continues to unfold, you may let go of any remaining tension, allowing the soft cadence of history to soothe your spirit and guide you toward a deep, restorative sleep. The labor required to harvest these precious white blossoms was governed by strict natural laws that dictated the exact timing of the daily routine within the workshop. Not because the volatile aromatic compounds within the jasmine flower were highly sensitive to heat and direct sunlight. The collection of the blossoms could only take place during the coolest hours of the night and early morning. The delicate flowers began to open as the sun went down, releasing their maximum fragrance into the cool night air. When the petals were free from the drying effects of the daytime sun, this natural cycle created a nighttime economy where groups of specialized pickers, known as cueilleurs, worked silently in the dark fields, their fingers moving verkepter at incredible speed and precisions to gather the blossoms before the first rays of dawn could compromise the quality of the essential oils trapped within the petals. The legal binding of an apprentice to a master perfumer in 18th century France was formalized through a notarized contract known as a contrat d'apprentissage, a document that stripped away personal autonomy in exchange for the systemic transmission of trade secrets. These legal agreements, bound by the overarching statutes of the Grasse Guild of Master Perfumers, typically demanded between 3 and 7 years of absolute devotion to the workshop. For the duration of this term, The apprentice received no monetary wages whatsoever. Instead, the relationship was transactional on an institutional level. The family of the apprentice often paid a significant upfront premium, an entry fee to secure a position under a respected master, trusting that the long-term investment into a highly lucrative elite trade. And the master, in return, was legally obligated to provide basic sustenance, which consisted of modest lodging or beneath the workshop benches, but beneath the boat base a regular ration of coarse bread and seasonal clothing suitable for the rigorous manual labour of the laboratory. This legal arrangement created a rigid hierarchy that governed every hour of the apprentice's life, erasing the distinction between day and night during the peak harvest season. Under the watchful eye of the guild inspectors, the contract held the weight of municipal law, meaning that any attempt by an apprentice to flee the workshop or neglect his duties was treated as a serious criminal offence if an apprentice walked out on his master. Before the expiration of the agreed-upon years, his name was inscribed into the black books of the guild, effectively barring him from ever seeking employment in any recognised perfume house or distillery across the Kingdom of France. The physical contract itself was preserved in a heavy leather portfolio within the municipal archive, bearing the wax seals of the town magistrates and the signatures of the guild wardens who held ultimate authority over the economic life of the valley. Beyond the physical demands of labour, the most critical clauses within the apprenticeship contract concerned the absolute preservation of operational secrecy. The formulas for blending essential oils, the exact ratios of fixing agents, and the specific durations required for the fat to absorb the floral aromas were treated as sovereign property of the workshop. Before an apprentice was permitted to handle the premium raw materials, he was required to swear a solemn oath of confidentiality. Before the assembled master perfumers at the guild hall, to reveal a Master S proprietary blend to a rival workshop or to record the proportions in an unauthorized notebook was classified as industrial espionage, an act that carried severe penalties including public denunciation, heavy financial restitution that fell upon the apprentice family, and potential imprisonment. This climate of enforced discretion meant that the apprentice worked in a state of constant mindfulness, knowing that the secret knowledge he was absorbing through daily repetition was a heavily guarded asset, protected by both legal statutes and the economic self-interest of the ruling merchant families of Grasse. The scientific foundation of cold enfleurage relied on a profound, empirical understanding of natural chemistry long before the modern vocabulary of molecular bonds was established. 18th century perfumers understood that certain non-volatile mediums possessed a natural affinity for the volatile scent particles carried through the air. This process took advantage of the lipophilic nature of the essential oils produced within the living tissues of the royal jasmine. Even after the flower was severed from its stem, its cellular metabolism continued for several hours, causing the bloom to breathe out its aromatic compounds into the immediate environment. If these delicate vapours were left in the open air, they would quickly dissipate and vanish and into the atmosphere. However, when trapped within a closed chamber directly above a layer of purified animal fat, the hydrophobic scent molecules naturally migrated toward the lipids, embedding themselves into the carbon chains of the grease. This passive extraction method was uniquely suited for flowers like jasmine and tuberose, whose aromatic structures were so fragile that the high temperatures of traditional steam distillations were scorched and blackened the delicate worthless, rendering the final product worthless. To achieve this molecular capture without ruining the final scent, the apprentice had to prepare a fat base that met highly specific physical criteria, a formula dictated by generations of workshop experimentation. Pure lard derived from pigs, known in the workshops as pork, was recognized as the superior absorbent medium due to its soft capacity to hold aromatic molecules. However, pig fat had a low melting point, which made it highly unstable during the intense heat of a southern French summer, carrying the risk that the grease might liquefy and run off the workspace. To provide the necessary structural stability, the apprentice blended the lard with clarified beef fat known as bœuf, which possessed a significantly higher melting point and a firmer molecular arrangement. The blending ratio was altered according to the progression of the seasons and the ambient temperature of the laboratory. During the peak heat of July, the guild standards required a mixture of 2 parts pork fat to 1 part beef fat. A precise calculation that yielded a base may be drawn solid up to 30 degrees Celsius, while retaining a receptive, buttery texture. The rendering and purification of this fat base, referred to as the core, was an exhausting and fastidious ritual that occurred weeks before the first flower buds opened in the fields. Raw animal fat could never be applied directly to the enfleurage frames, because its natural pungent odour would instantly contaminate the pure floral fragrance. The apprentice spent successive days melting the raw tallows over a slow fire of olive wood, skimming away the floating impurities with a copper skimmer, before washing the liquid grease repeatedly in clear river water. This washing process was repeated up to 10 times, often incorporating a weak solution of natural lye made from wood ash to neutralize the free fatty acids that caused rancidity. After the final washing, the fat was strained through layers of unbleached linen to remove any microscopic sediment, treated with a minute quantity of alum as a preservative, and poured into deep stoneware crocks to cool in the cellar. The final product was a perfectly uniform, snow-white ointment that was entirely devoid of any animal smell, offering a clean canvas that would faithfully record the aromatic history of the upcoming harvest. The physical containers of this delicate molecular process were the specialized wooden frames known as the structural backbone of the entire cold enfleurage technique. These frames were not mere utilitarian trays, but precision instruments, technical standards established by the municipal authorities and guild inspectors of Grasse. Each chassis was constructed from premium seasoned oak, a wood chosen specifically for its dense grain and remarkable resistance to warping when exposed to the high humidity of the southern French summer. Furthermore, oak was completely devoid of the pungent resins and volatile saps found in softer woods like pine or fir, ensuring that no external timber odours would leach into the purified animal fats. The assembly of the wooden joints required the skills of expert joiners who utilized tongue and groove joints without the aid of iron nails, as raw iron could rust over time and leave black streaks across the wood, potentially contaminating the purity of the unguents. The dimensions of these frames were strictly standardized by the Guild regulations of 1724 to ensure uniformity across all local workshops. A standard chassis measured approximately 2 feet in width by 3 feet in length, with a shallow raised wooden border of about half an inch surrounding a central pane of thick flat glass. This standardization allowed hundreds of frames to be stacked neatly on top of one another, creating a perfect seal that isolated the delicate interior from the outside air. The glass panes used in the center of the frames represented a significant capital investment for the master perfumer, as flat plate glass in the 18th century was a luxury commodity manufactured by specialized glass factories through the cylinder method. The glass had to be completely flat, devoid of large air bubbles or structural ripples that could cause uneven distribution of the fat layer. The edges of the glass pane were carefully fitted into a channeled groove within the oak putty and sealed a crushed chalk and linseed oil made from crushed chalk and linseed, ensuring that the glass remained securely in place through years of daily handling, washing, and scraping. During the long night hours, the apprentice moved these heavy wooden structures with a practiced rhythmic deliberation, the mechanical repetition of lifting a chassis from the drying rack, placing it flat upon the oak workbench, and inspecting its surface for any hairline fractures in the wood or glass, formed the quiet baseline of the evening. Each frame had to be perfectly clean and dry before the application of the fat base, meaning the apprentice had to wipe down the glass surfaces with unbleached linen cloths to remove any moisture or dust. The weight of the oak frames, combined with the glass, created a substantial physical burden when handled in large quantities, yet the apprentice was required to stack them with absolute silence and precision to prevent the glass from cracking against the stone floors. This careful management of the physical tools of the trade underscored the high stakes of the perfume economy, where a single broken frame meant not only the loss of expensive materials, but the potential ruin of a full day of harvested blossoms. As the deep midnight hours settle over the stone walls of the workshop, and the steady rhythm of history continues to provide a soothing sanctuary for your mind, we prepare to leave the apprentice at his workbench for a brief moment. But all rights reserved. Until next time, listen closely to the whispers of the past, because you never know what timeless wisdom might quietly find its way into your night. Good night, everyone. The execution of the cold enfleurage technique demanded a level of material precision that extended to the very hand tools utilized by the apprentice throughout the night. Chief among these instruments was the specialized spatula, known in the French workshops as the spatule, a tool specifically designed to manipulate the purified animal fats. Without altering their chemical composition, guild regulations strictly prohibited the use of iron or low-grade copper spatulas because these base metals were highly susceptible to oxidation when brought into contact with the fatty acids present in the lard and beef tallow. An oxidized tool would leave microscopic metallic deposits within the fat base, triggering a chain reaction of rancidity that would utterly destroy the delicate top notes of the jasmine scent. To prevent this economic disaster, the master perfumer provided spatulas crafted exclusively from sterling silver or meticulously polished oiled animal bone, typically sourced from the shin bones of cattle. The bone spatula was favored for its unique combination of rigidity and flexibility, allowing the apprentice to apply a uniform, razor-thin layer of grease across the glass pane with a single sweeping motion that required immense wrist control and years of silent practice. As you follow the meticulous movements of the apprentice and feel the weight of this ancient craftsmanship settling over your mind, it is comforting to remember that you are part of a shared journey through time. Taking these slow, deliberate steps into the past allows the mind to find a rare and necessary respite from the constant demands of the modern day. If this peaceful sanctuary of history brings comfort to your evening, please consider supporting our quiet centuries and subscribing to Whispers of Centuries. Your silent companionship and gentle support are deeply valued, helping to keep this midnight laboratory alive as you allow your thoughts to drift further into a state of serene relaxation and untroubled Before the purified fat could be spread upon the chassis, the glass surfaces had to undergo a rigorous and standardized cleaning protocol that served as the workshop's primary defense against contamination. The apprentice began this process by washing each glass pane with a warm solution of raw lye, which was produced on site by leaching water through the white ashes of hardwood charcoal collected from the furnace. This highly alkaline solution effectively saponified any microscopic grease or old pomade left behind from previous production cycles. Not to sring the glass cycle, stripping the glass down to its raw, crystalline state. Following the lye wash, the glass was thoroughly rinsed hat pure well water, and then subjected to a final purification using highly rectified spirit of wine, known as Esprit de Vie. This potent alcohol evaporated almost instantly into the air, carrying away any lingering moisture and leaving behind a completely sterile, entirely scentless surface that would not interfere with the natural respiration of the incoming jasmine blossoms. The sharp, clean scent of the evaporating spirit briefly filled the cool air of the laboratory, a fleeting chemical contrast to the heavy masonry walls and the dull, oily smell of the tallow candles that kept the darkness at bay. As the spirit of wine evaporated completely from the crystalline panes of the chassis, the focus of the laboratory shifted toward the heavy wooden entrance where the first agricultural yields of the night were about to arrive. But the economic reality of Grasse in 1760 was deeply intertwined with an ancient system of land tenure known as meticulous, a sharecropping arrangement that defined the relationship between the wealthy elite of the town and the peasant families who inhabited the rural valleys. Under a standard meticulous contract, a master perfumer or a bourgeois landowner provided the terraced plots of land, the initial jasmine saplings imported from global trade routes, and the necessary tools for cultivation. The sharecropper provided the absolute dedication of family labor, tending to the vines throughout the harsh winter pruning and the dry spring months. When the summer harvest arrived, the total yield of the jasmine crop was strictly divided by weight, typically on a 50-50 basis between the landlord and the tenant, ensuring that the wealth generated by the perfume trade was anchored in a rigid social hierarchy that kept the agrarian labor force not dependent on the urban merchant class. This agricultural system culminated each summer night in the highly synchronized ritual of the midnight harvest, an operations performed by specialized field workers known as cueilleurs. The collection of jasmine blossoms required a delicate touch that heavy manual laborers could rarely provide, meaning the fields were filled primarily hat local women, and older, slender fingers could detach the delicate white stars without bruising the petals, moving silently through the narrow stone terraces under the dim illumination of the moon. These pickers worked with astonishing speed, knowing that every minute wasted brought them closer to the destructive heat of the sun. Guild regulations and empirical science dictated that jasmine must never be harvested during daylight hours. The reason was entirely chemical. Direct sunlight accelerated the evaporation of the light, while simultaneously triggering the release of heavier, undesirable indole compounds that altered the purity of the scent. If a flower was exposed to not be sun before being picked, its essential oil composition shifted, resulting in a coarse to morning's animalic aroma that would compromise the premium quality of the final pomade. The physical reality of the midnight harvest was a testament to human endurance, as the pickers faced the damp, chilly air while maintaining a protected the crop. Were cueilleurs made to accompany. Each picker carried a shallow wicker basket woven from local willow branches, lined with damp, unbleached linen cloths to preserve the moisture and coolness of the harvested blooms. The fingers of the cueilleurs had to pinch the stem exactly at the base of the calyx, ensuring that no green leaves or stalks were mixed with the white petals, as any foreign green material would introduce a bitter herbaceous note into the absorbing fat base. As the baskets filled, they were covered with additional damp cloths to prevent the night wind from drying out the delicate tissues. These baskets were then transported immediately down the rocky paths to the town gates, where the apprentice waited in the dim light of the laboratory entry to receive the fragile cargo, verifying the origins of the harvest and logging the weights before the transformation process could begin. Because the physical and chemical phenomenon that occurred within the sealed confines of the chassis was a master quietly in the dark hours of diffusion, operating quietly in the dark hours of the night. Once the baskets of fresh royal jasmine were delivered to the oak workbench, the apprentice began the precise task of scattering across the prepared layer of fat. This process was not done haphazardly, but with a calculated spacing that maximized the surface area of exposure. 18th century perfumers had observed that the living tissues of the jasmine flower did not perish immediately upon being severed from the vine. Instead, the cellular respiration of the bloom continued for many hours, during which its precious volatiles and exhaled its precious volatile oils. By placing these breathing flowers directly onto the white ointment, the apprentice initiated a passive extraction process where the natural moisture and atmospheric pressure of the closed frame guided the migration of the scent particles. Only bedoming. The mechanics of this migration relied entirely on the concept of vapor pressure, which varied according to the subtle fluctuations of temperature within the laboratory. As the warm air of the July night lingered just outside the thick stone walls, the interior of the room remained cool enough to keep the fat base stable, but warm enough to allow the essential oils within the petals to volatilize. The scent molecules, possessing a natural lipophilic or fat-loving structure, drifted upward and outward from the petals, filling the minute pocket of airns trapped between the glass panes. Because the concentration of these aromatic compounds was high within the flower, and non-existent within the purified fat, the natural law of equilibrium forced the molecules to diffuse evenly through the airspace. Upon making physical contact with the smooth surface of the lard and beef tallow mixture, the hydrophobic scent particles were pulled into the lipid matrix, bonding seamlessly with the fatty acid chains and becoming permanently fixed within the solid medium. This invisible transition required an environment of absolute stillness and darkness to reach its full potential. Any sudden draft of wind or agitation of the frames would disrupt the delicate gradient of vapor pressure, causing the volatile top notes to escape before they could be absorbed by the waiting grease. The apprentice understood that time was the ultimate catalyst in this equation, as the diffusion of these complex organic compounds occurred at a remarkably slow pace, requiring hours of uninterrupted contact for a single layer of flowers to fully saturate the outermost layer of the fat. The natural philosophy of the era often described this phenomenon as the collection of ethereal effluvia, a poetic term, a rigorous physical process of chemical absorption. This slow, silent exchange between the vegetable kingdom and the animal medium formed the quiet core of the entire enfleurage technique, transforming the mechanical labor of the laboratory into a precise demonstration of natural philosophy that defied the primitive chemical understanding of the era, while delivering an unmatched level of aromatic purity. The apprentice watched the white stars of the jasmine rest against the snow-white surface of the fat, knowing that beneath the visible stillness, an intricate dance of elements was unfolding in the dark. The manual execution of stacking the loaded frames, known technically in the Grasse workshops as the chute de chassis, was the critical phase where the open air was banished and the process of scent lock began. After the apprentice had meticulously distributed the fresh blossoms across the layer of fat, each frame could no longer remain exposed to the ambient atmosphere of the laboratory. The apprentice lifted the heavy oak chassis with both hands, balancing the weight of the thick glass and placed it squarely on top of the preceding frame. This action was repeated until a vertical column of frames rose from the slate floor toward the vaulted stone ceiling, forming a structural tower of aromatic capture. The exact alignment of the wooden borders was essential, as even a minor deviation of a fraction of an inch would allow a gap to form, compromising the integrity of the entire stack. By stacking the chassis in this manner, the wooden borders pressed firmly against one another, effectively creating a series of individualite chambers. Refined individual airtight chambers. This method established a localized anaerobic environment for each layer of flowers, which was vital for regulating the chemical transformation taking place on the glass. In the absence of circulating air currents, the atmospheric pressure within each sealed frame stabilized, drastically reducing the rate of evaporations of the most volatile scent component. Specifically, this airtight seal prevented the rapid loss of benzyl acetate, the primary organic compound responsible for the intense sweet top notes of the royal jasmine, and controlled the release of indole, a heavier compound that provided depth but could become unpleasantly dominant if allowed to oxidize in the open air. The isolation of these molecules within the lipid matrix was thus guaranteed by the physical weight of the timber tower. As you listen to the rhythmic details of this historical laboratory, and imagine the towering columns of oak and glass standing silently in the dark, you are invited to take a deep breath and let your remaining thoughts settle into the quiet night. If you have journeyed with us this far and found a sense of calm in these historical narratives, you might consider leaving a gentle comment to share your thoughts, as your presence is a beautiful part of the Whispers of Centuries family. Let your mind rest completely now, knowing that there is nothing more you need to accomplish tonight, and allow the steady progression of the story to carry you closer to a peaceful sleep. The physical strain of building these towers was a silent testament to the endurance required of an apprentice during the peak harvest seasons. Each loaded chassis weighed several pounds, and as the column grew higher, the apprentice had to lift the heavy structures above his shoulders, careful not to tilt the frame and disturb the carefully spaced blossoms. The absolute silence of this task was mandated by the master perfumer, as any sudden impact or clattering of the heavy wood could shatter the expensive plate glass or cause the fat base to shift on its foundation. The room became a maze of these dark wooden obelisks, each one a self-contained chemical reactor, how slowly surrendered their identity to the white grease. We are co-under la bossi today. Through this mechanical architecture of containment, the workshop transformed the fleeting beauty of a summer field into a stable, quantifiable asset, securing the precious volatile essences within an unyielding fortress of stone, wood and time. While the towers of stacked chassis cast long shadows across the stone floor, the master perfumer sat quietly at a small desk in the corner of the laboratory. Illuminated by the steady yellow glow of an oil lamp, on the worn surface of the desk lay the livre de raison, a massive account book bound in heavy oil-stained calfskin that served as the financial and administrative heart of the workshop. This book was far more than a mere record of daily expenses. It was a comprehensive ledger of family heritage and commercial survival, containing decades of accumulated economic wisdom and trade strategy. The paper inside was thick and coarse, handmade from linen rags at a local mill along the Siangya River, its rough edges bearing the faint watermark of the provincial tax collector. Each page was divided into neat hand-drawn columns, meticulously organized to track the complex flow of capital, materials, and labor that sustained the perfume house through the volatile markets of the 18th century. The apprentice watched from the workbench as the master dipped a freshly sharpened goose quill into a small ceramic inkwell filled, verkepte, had dark iron gall ink. The sharp rhythmic scratch of the quill against the textured paper was the only sound breaking the midnight stillness of the laboratory. In these pages, the master recorded the precise expenditures required to secure the raw components of the current harvest, documenting the payments made to the sharecroppers for their daily yields of royal jasmine and the purchasing costs of beef and pork fats from the butcher guilds. For neighbouring towns, like Antibes and Cannes, every log of wood brought into the workshops was accounted for, alongside the price of coarse listless used for straining the fats. This rigorous attention to financial detail was necessary to navigate the heavy burden of local tithes and royal duties, ensuring that the workshop maintained its delicate margin of profitability against the rising costs of production during the summer months. The final sections of the active ledger pages were dedicated to the wholesale transactions that connected the remote valley of Grasse to the elite consumer markets of the French capital. The master carefully calculated the wholesale prices, or prix de gros, operating in the fashionable districts of Paris, such as the Rue Saint-Honore and the Palais Royal. These calculations required a deep understanding of logistics, as the master had to factor in the considerable expenses of securing armed guards and heavy transport wagons to carry the delicate pomades across hundreds of miles of poorly maintained post roads. A single entry in the ledger could represent months of negotiations with Parisian agents who demanded the highest standards of purity for the royal court. The slow repetitive movement of the master, hand writing down the long columns of figures, created a calming cadence in the room, translating the physical labour of the fields and the laboratory into a silent language of wealth and economic endurance. The evolution of fragrance recorded within the master ledger reflected a profound shift in the olfactory culture of the French aristocracy, a transition that directly altered the agricultural landscape of Grasse. Throughout the 17th century and the long reign of Louis XIV, the olfactory preferences of the royal court had been dominant aromatic substances such as musk, cess, weltam, civet, and ambergris. These powerful, enduring scents were utilized not merely for personal adornment, but as a desperate defense against the poor sanitation and disease that plagued the crowded corridors of the royal palaces. The heavy musks possessed the chemical strength required to mask the unwashed realities of the era, creating an intense, suffocating cloud of fragrance around the nobility that signaled their high social status through sheer sensory dominance. However, by the middle of the 18th century, a new aesthetic philosophy, Paris, began to take root in the salons of Paris and the private chambers of Versailles, moving away from these aggressive animalic secretions in favour of delicate, ethereal floral bouquets. This historical transformation was driven in large part by the influential taste of Madame de Pompadour and the court of Louis XV, which became celebrated across Europe as La Cour Parfumée or the perfumed court. Under this new regime of refinement, the heavy, dark scents of the past were rejected as primitive and overbearing. Associated with an older, less enlightened way of life, the new aristocratic ideal demanded absolute freshness, transpolities that could only be achieved through the meticulous extraction of Jasmine, decked of delicate petals like jasmine. When rose and orange blossom, the royal court became so obsessed with these fleeting floral notes that a strict court etiquette emerged, dictating that a completely different fragrance must be worn every single day of the week to be with separate scents designated for the morning apartments, the afternoon hunts, and the evening balls. This constant, insatiable demand for fresh floral waters and scented transformed fragrant clustered from an essentially ritual of the ruling class, where the ruling class placing immense economic pressure on the workshops of Grasse to maximize their production. For the apprentice working in the quiet laboratory, this cultural shift meant that the work on the enfleurage frames was directly connected to the highest echelons of political influence and social prestige. The snow-white fat on the glass panes was being primed to carry the precise botanical signature demanded by the most powerful figures of the age. The transition to floral preferences required an extraordinary increase in manual precision and labour, as thousands of individual jasmine blossoms were needed to produce even a small jar of premium pomade, compared to the long-lasting potency of a few grains of animal musk. This economic reality ensured that the quiet, repetitive motions of the apprentice throughout the summer nights were the essential foundation upon which the entire of the French sensory apparatus of the French state was constructed, turning the humble labour of a provincial workshop into a vital artery of imperial luxury and cultural definition. The mathematical precision required within the laboratory was further complicated by the intricate and archaic system of weights and measures songs that governed 18th century French commerce long before the uniform standardization of the metric system. Every calculation performed by the master and executed by the apprentice relied on the ancient system of the king's weight, known as the poids de marque, which was strictly monitored by municipal officials to prevent fraud in the high-value luxury trade. To measure the heavy quantities of purified lard and beef tallow, the apprentice utilized a large balance scale constructed from forged iron, suspended from a central oak beam in the ceiling by thick hemp ropes. The two deep brass pans of the scale swung gently in the dim light to ensure that the accumulation of dust or residual oil did not distort the delicate balance. For smaller, more precious ingredients like the imported resins or specialized fixing agents, a smaller handheld scale made of polished steel and kept in a velvet-lined wooden box was employed, capable of measuring down to the smallest fractions of a unit. The units of measurement themselves formed a complex mathematical language and endless repetition concentration from the apprentice throughout the long night hours. The largest standard unit was the livre, which was roughly equivalent to a modern pound, but varied significantly between different provinces of France, making the Grasse standards unique to the Region S trade agreements. The livre was subdivided into 16 onces, which provided the standard batches of animal fat applied to the enfleurage frames, for the highly concentrated botanical essences and rare aromatic powders. The once was further divided into 8 grows, and each grows was composed of 72 individual grains. This meant that a single grain represented an incredibly minute particle of matter, roughly equivalent to the weight of a single dried cereal grain. When the master dictated a formula, the apprentice had to carefully select from a set of nested brass weights, each stamped with the official mark of the guild inspectors, and arrange them on the scale pan with small iron tweezers to prevent the natural oils of his fingers from altering the weight. The sheer monotony of this weighing process served as a calming ritual subtraction of material required absolute physical stillness and patience, where welcome skills patience, the apprentice would stand before the scales, holding his breath as the balanced needle fluctuated back and forth, waiting for the exact moment of equilibrium, when the two pans aligned perfectly in the candlelight. To prepare a compound of scented pomade, the recipe might call for 12 livres of purified core, mixed with 3 ounces and 4 grows of clarified beeswax, and exactly 52 grains of ground benzoin resin. The numbers were repeated aloud by the master and muttered by the apprentice as he worked, creating a continuous rhythmic chant of quantity that filled the quiet space of the laboratory. This ancient mathematical discipline ensured that every batch of fragrance produced in the Grasse maintained an identical olfactory profile, allowing the wealthy consumers in distant cities to recognize the unmistakable quality of a master's brand through the chaotic diversity of pre-revolutionary measurements. The economic reach of the Grasse fragrance industry extended far beyond the geographic boundaries of the Provence Valley, connecting the quiet stone workshops directly to the vast maritime trade networks that spanned the globe in the 18th century, while the local fields provided the delicate floral components like jasmine and rose. A truly exceptional perfume required fixatives of extraordinary stability, materials that could only be acquired through the bustling port of Marseille. Located just a few days' journey along the Mediterranean coast, Marseille served as the primary maritime gateway for the Kingdom of France, receiving merchant ships from every corner of the known world. Among the most influential entities driving this global trade was the French East India Company, known as the Compagnie des Indes, whose heavy, armed merchant vessels braved the treacherous ocean currents and maritime rivalries of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans to bring back exotic commodities not to Acantes for the luxury markets of Europe. Within the dark holds of these massive wooden ships, packed alongside fine silks and rare spices, were the raw, aromatic resins that the master perfumers of Grasse required to anchor their fleeting floral creations. One of the most sought-after imports was benzoin, a dense balsamic resin, harvested from the bark of styrax trees to the humid forests of Sumatra, Siam, and the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. Local harvesters in those distant lands would make deep incisions in the tree trunks, allowing them harden under the tropical sun into brittle, pale golden tears, gold. Once dried, these resin tears were packed into sturdy wooden crates lined with kepi hat dried leaves and loaded onto the company ships at colonial ports. When these vessels finally dropped anchor in the crowded harbour of Marseille, the crates were subjected to strict customs inspections and evaluated by specialised trade brokers who represented the elite perfume of Grasse. The elite perfume houses of Grasse. In addition to the East Asian benzoin, the port of Marseille received regular shipments of liquid styrax, a thick, highly fragrant resin gathered from the mountain forests of the Levant region in the eastern Mediterranean. This material, harvested from the liquidambar trees by local woodsmen, had been traded across the Mediterranean since antiquity. Warm balsamic properties, the trade routes of the Levant, merchant houses operating under royal trade treaties, ensuring a steady supply of this to the southern ports of France. From the docks of Marseille, these exotic resins were loaded onto the backs of pack mules or packed securely into heavy transport wagons that slowly navigated the dusty, winding coastal roads of Provence, climbing higher into the hills until they reached the stone gates of Grasse. When these global commodities finally arrived at the laboratory, it was the duty of the apprentice to carefully unpack the heavy crates, verifying the purity and weight of the resins against the manifests provided by the transport drivers. The dry, warm and balsamic aroma of the raw benzone and styrax filled the cool air of the workshop, creating a stark contrast with the clean smell of the animal fats and the delicate sweetness of the fresh jasmine blossoms. As the apprentice handled these hardened tiers of resin, he was directly touching the physical evidence of an immense global empire, a commercial network that connected the manual labour of a young worker in a French workshop to the distant forest communities of the East, and the grand maritime strategies of the European powers. Among the various raw materials stored within the dark wooden cabinets of the Grasse laboratory, none required a greater exercise in patience and long-term planning than the primary plant-based fixative known as orris root. Sourced from the roots of Iris pallida and Iris florentina, this precious substance was cultivated extensively on the rocky, sun-drenched hillsides of Tuscany, particularly around the city of Florence. The trade routes linking the Italian agricultural sectors to the perfume of France had been well established for generations, ensuring that a steady supply of these specialized rhizomes arrived at the workshop in large burlap sacks. However, unlike the fresh jasmine blossoms that yielded their fragrance within a single evening, the orris root was completely odorless when first extracted from the earth, requiring a meticulous and time-consuming aging process before it could offer any value to the master perfumer. The secret of the orris root lay within a slow chemical transformation period that occurred over a mandatory full years, of no less than 3 full years. After the roots were harvested by Italian farmers, they were carefully peeled by hand, washed in clean well water, and laid out on large wicker mats to dry under the Mediterranean sun. Once the initial moisture was removed, the dried rhizomes were transported to the dark, well-ventilated attics of the Grasse workshops, where they were left undisturbed for 36 months. During this prolonged period of dormancy, the odorless starches and fatty acids, locked within the dense cellular structure of the root, underwent a gradual process of oxidative degradation. This slow aging allowed the root to synthesize a unique group of volatile ketones known as irones, organic compounds that possessed a deep powdery aroma resembling the scent of wild violets, while simultaneously developing immense fixative properties. For the apprentice, the integration of this aged material into the current production cycle required a high degree of physical labor and careful measurement. Before the orris root could be introduced to the animal fat base, the hardened, stone-like rhizomes had to be reduced to an ultra-fine powder. The apprentice used a heavy iron mortar and pestle, lifting the weighted into smaller, writhe fragments before transferring them to a specialized stone hand mill. The continuous scraping sound of the millstones, turning in the quiet room, created a steady hum that marked the slow progression of the midnight hours. The resulting dust was then passed through a fine silk sieve, ensuring that only the most microscopic particles were gathered for the final formula. The chemical function of the aged orris powder within the cold enfleurage technique was to act as a natural anchor for the highly volatile scent molecules of the royal jasmine. when a minute quantity of the powder was blended into the saps and resins that coated the storage vessels. The irons within the orris root formed weak intermolecular bonds with the lighter benzyl acetate molecules of the flowers. This subtle interaction drastically reduced the rate of evaporation, ensuring that the bright, fleeting top notes of the jasmine were permanently bound to the heavy lipid matrix of the fat base. Without this botanical fixative, the finished perfume would lose its distinctive character within a matter of hours after application, breaking down under the natural heat of the skin, Through the deliberate combination of Tuscan agricultural patience and the mechanical precision of the apprentice, the workshop successfully captured the essence of summer, securing the volatile beauty of the harvest within a stable soap matrix designed to endure for years. Beyond the silent rows of oak chassis, where the jasmine blossoms carried out their invisible work of molecular diffusion, the furthermost corner of the dark laboratory housed a different type of technological heritage. Standing tall upon a brick furnace was the massive copper distillation apparatus known as the alembic. This striking vessel represented a profound line of intellectual inheritance that stretched back through centuries of human history, serving as a physical monument to the preservation of ancient science. The design of the alembic used in 18th century Provence was not a modern French invention, but a direct lineage and age of medieval Arabic chemistry. Inherited the gold. The very word alembic was derived from the Arabic term al-anbic, which referred to the specialized still head used for purification. The master perfumers of Grasse relied heavily on the translated manuscripts of scholars like Jabir ibn Hayyan and al-Kindi, who had perfected the art of complex distillation in the laboratories of Baghdad and Damascus during the 8th and 9th centuries. These ancient texts, which detailed the exact behavior of volatile substances when subjected to controlled heat, had been preserved by monastic scribes during the Middle Ages, and because we became the foundational textbooks and apothecary guilds of southern France. Not fragrance. The physical structure of the copper alembic was an exquisite demonstration of industrial metallurgy, beaten into shape by the master coppersmiths of Lyon or Marseille. The entire apparatus was constructed from thick sheets of red copper, a metal chosen specifically for its exceptional thermal conductivity and its unique chemical resistance to organic acids. The base of the still was a deep, pear-shaped cauldron called the cucurbit, which was embedded directly into a wood-fired brick hearth. Atop this cauldron sat the heavy cap or still head, often referred to as the Moor-S head due to its traditional rounded shape. This cap functioned as an expansion chamber where the rising aromatic vapours would collect as the water inside boiled. Arching away from the cap was a long, elegant copper tube known as the swan's neck, which curved downward into a massive, circulating mountain water filled with circulatant. Inside this vat, the copper tube transformed into a coiled spiral called the worm pipe, exposing the hot vapours to a maximum surface area of cold liquid to force rapid condensation. The entire system had to be perfectly sealed at every joint, using a thick paste made from ground linseed meal and unbleached clay, a sealant known as the lute of science, which prevented any precious vapours from escaping into the room. While the current season demanded the cold extraction of jasmine, the alembic was routinely utilised to produce the highly valued rose water, or eau de rose, which formed the aromatic base for countless mid-century cosmetics. During the apprentice of identical long nights Maging had spent beneath the cucurbit, managing the fire beneath the cucurbit, packing the vessel with hundreds of pounds of freshly gathered centifolia roses and pure spring water, As the furnace heat penetrated the copper base, the steam tore open the microscopic oil glands located on the surface of the rose petals, or carrying the volatile rose molecules upward through the swan S-neck and down into the cooling spiral. The condensed liquid emerged drop by drop from the end of the worm pipe. Collecting in specialized glass vessels called Florentine receivers, where the light, precious essential oil naturally floated to the top, allowing the dense, fragrant hydrosol to be drawn off from below. The rhythmic, steady dripping of the distillate into the glass receivers created a mesmerizing soundscape that echoed off the stone walls, a monotonous acoustic pattern that mirrored the repetitive nature of the apprentice life. Even in the dead of July, the faint, sweet memory of the distilled roses clung to the porous copper walls of the still, mingling with the deep, balsamic aroma of the resins and the freshness of the entire cycle of the provincial harvest within the silent mechanics of the workshop. Within the silent, not the operational success of both the copper distillation still and the delicate purification of animal fats depended entirely on a secondary infrastructure that was often invisible to the casual. Observer but vital to the survival of Grasse. This was the intricate network of stone aqueducts, open stone channels, and subterranean mountain water that directed fresh mountain water throughout the high terraces of the town. Long before the construction of modern municipal utilities, the artisans of the valley relied on the natural springs of the pre-Alps, particularly the ancient Fu spring and various managed channels diverting water from the Siangye River basin. The entire industrial layout of the town was dictated by the flow of these waters, which descended from the higher rocky cliffs through a series of gravity-fed channels weaving through the stone foundations of the workshops before emptying into the agricultural plains below. This complex hydraulic system was heavily protected and managed by specialized municipal magistrates known as water wardens, who enforced strict legal codes regarding water usage, ensuring that the water remained clean and evenly distributed among the competing needs of the citizens and the expanding workshops of the master perfumers. For the apprentice, this network of flowing water was a constant presence in the daily routine, serving as the fine wash for the raw materials. During the initial stages of preparing the fat base, the absolute clarity of the water used was just as critically of the tallows themselves. The apprentice used the flowing water from the workshop's private stone basin to wash the melted lard after its initial rendering over the charcoal furnace. This mechanical washing process required the apprentice to fat into deep wooden troughs filled with icy mountain water. The cold temperature caused the fat to solidify rapidly into fine granules, exposing a massive surface area to the cleansing action of the water. This allowed any water-soluble impurities, residual cellular tissues, and volatile short-chain acids to be dissolved and carried away, leaving behind a perfectly neutralized lipid matrix. Without an abundant supply of fresh, untainted water, the fat base would retain organic impurities that would cause it to turn rancid within a few weeks, spoiling the expensive jasmine harvest and resulting in an unacceptable financial loss for the master. In addition to purifying the fat, the municipal water lines were essential for regulating the intense thermal reactions taking place within the copper alembic. The large wooden vat surrounding the coiled copper worm pipe had to be kept at a consistently low temperature to ensure the efficient condensation of the aromatic steam. As the hot vapors travelled from the copper, they transferred their thermal energy to the surrounding water, causing the liquid in the vat to heat up rapidly. If this water was allowed to become warm, the condensation process would slow down, causing an increase in internal pressure that could rupture the sealed joints of the still or cause the volatile essences to escape as uncondensed gas. To prevent this, the apprentice had to maintain a vigilant watch over the cooling apparatus, constantly operating a small wooden sluice gate that allowed hot surface water to drain out of the vat while simultaneously drawing fresh icy water from the incoming stone conduit. This continuous thermal exchange kept the copper pipe cold, forcing the steam to transform immediately into precious drops of rose or lavender water. The management of these water rights within the town was a source of constant legal oversight and social organizations. During the 18th century, the municipal statutes of Grasse dictated the exact hours of the day and night during which a shehat, specific neighborhood and workshop, could open their primary intake valves to fill their storage cisterns, because water was treated as a highly valuable shared currency of production. Any unauthorized diversion of the flow outside of 1s designated hours was imposed by the guild and the town council. Night watchmen patrolled the dark streets, listening closely to the sound of rushing water to ensure that no rogue operator was stealing the flow intended for the public fountains or neighboring laboratories. The gentle rhythmic murmur of the water, travelling through the stone channels outside the steepy backgrounds with the thick walls of the midnight watch. To the long hours of the midnight watch, a liquid metronome that connected the industrial mechanics of the perfume trade to the ancient enduring geography of the Provençal hillsides. The integrity of the luxury trade in Grasse was constantly shielded from the temptations of illicit profit through a rigorous system of market oversight managed by the guild wardens, known in the French legal system as the jures. These sworn inspectors were senior masters elected by the guild assembly, entrusted with absolute legal authority to enter any workshop or storage facility without prior warning, at any hour of the day or night. The primary objective of these unannounced nocturnal visitations was to detect and eliminate commercial fraud, which threatened to undermine the prestigious reputation of Grasse commodities in the demanding markets of Paris and international courts. In an era where the value of a single jar of jasmine pomade could equal the annual earnings of an ordinary labourer, the incentive for unscrupulous operators to adulterate their raw materials was a constant challenge that required a high degree of testing from the governing council. One of the most frequent methods of adulteration encountered by the guild inspectors involved the illicit substitution of into the enfleurage base. While the official guild standards strictly mandated a precise blend of highly purified pork lard to achieve the optimum melting point and absorbent capacity, the core manteau balls of dishonest workshops would sometimes attempt to secretly incorporate mutton or sheep fat, known as souffle de mouton. Mutton fat was significantly cheaper and more abundant than premium lard, but it possessed a heavy, persistent animalic odour that could then never be fully neutralised by water washing or lye treatment. Furthermore, sheep fat contained a high concentration of stearin, which caused the fat base to become excessively brittle and waxy, preventing the smooth, uniform spreading required on the glass chassis. To detect this specific fraud, the jaws carried specialized bone density weights and instruments to measure the melting behavior of the grease. They would take a small sample of the white ointment from the storage crocks, place it on a polished silver plate, and gently heat it over a small candle to observe the exact temperature at which it turned to liquid, as any hidden mutton fat would cause the mixture to separate unevenly or leave a cloudy, yellow residue that exposed the deception. Another critical area of economic regulation was the purity of the yellow and white beeswax, utilized as a hardening agent in the production of solid cosmetics and scented sticks. Fraudulent merchants frequently mixed pure beeswax with cheap tallow, vegetable starches, or resinous tree saps to artificially increase the weight of the raw blocks delivered to the workshops. When the inspectors discovered a suspicious consignment of wax, they would execute a series of physical tests, slicing through the dense blocks with a wire cutter to examine the internal grain structure. As pure wax exhibited smooth, uniform matte surfaces, while adulterated wax appeared crumbly and uneven. The apprentice watched the master record these regulations in the margins of the workshop journal, knowing that the strict enforcement of these standards was the only element preventing the market from dissolving into chaos. Through this unyielding framework of legal inspections and physical testing, the Guild of Master Perfumers maintained complete sovereignty over the quality of their exports, complete spalls call, ensuring that every ounce of fragrance departing the valley was an authentic testament to the rigorous craftsmanship of Grasse. The concept of the maître parfumeur, or master perfumer, was far more than a technical designation achieved through years of manual labour. It was an elite social and political title that carried significant authority within the municipal governance of Grasse. By the middle of the 18th century, the wealthiest master perfumers had successfully elevated themselves from the status of ordinary artisans into a powerful merchant aristocracy, frequently recognized as the haute bourgeoisie of the Provence region. These influential the daily individuals of rendering au Versailles daling cauldrons and spreading flower petals. Home sui cauldron, Tunis. They occupied prominent seats on the town council, known as the Conseil de Ville or the Consulat, where they served as civic consuls and municipal magistrates. In these governing roles, the master perfumers possessed direct control over public works projects and the security of the commercial routes, navigators, the works valley, effectively ensuring that the laws and infrastructure of the town were continuously designed to support the expanding global trade of the fragrance industry. This accumulation of political influence was mirrored by the immense dynastic wealth that flowed into the prominent perfumer families over successive generations. In establishments founded by respected local lineages began to build vast commercial empires that permanently transformed the architectural landscape of Grasse itself. The substantial profits extracted from the international distribution of jasmine pomades, distilled orange blossom waters, and luxury scented gloves allowed these families the construction of grand stone townhouses, houses particuliers, known as hotels particuliers. These majestic residences were constructed from finely cut ashlar limestone and featured elegant wrought iron balconies that overlooked the steep, winding streets of the town centre, serving as permanent monuments to the family financial success and social ascendancy. Inside these opulent homes, situated far away from the heavy, oily vapours of valuable tapestries, the fine porcelain imported from the East, and extensive private libraries, adopting the refined manners and luxurious lifestyle of nobility while maintaining a firm operates that funded their grandeur. The social position of a master perfumer was uniquely resilient because, in a highly specialized, non-replicable form of material properties of intellectual and material property. While the traditional nobility derived their income from agricultural rents that fluctuated wildly with the weather seasons, the perfume dynasties operated at the intersection of global maritime trade and royal luxury preference. A master perfumer was a vital asset to the provincial economy, recognised by the royal crown as a major source of export revenue for the Kingdom of France. This economic utility granted the masters a unique level of social mobility, allowing their children to purchase lucrative judicial offices within the regional parliaments or marry into established noble families, thus subtly shifting the rigid class divisions of the pre-revolutionary era. For the apprentice working diligently in the quiet lower level of the workshop, looking up at the heavy timber beams that separated his world of manual labour from the master opulent family quarters above, the title of maître represented the ultimate symbol of security and social power, an elusive destination that required a lifetime of absolute dedication to the mastery of the air. The financial strategy of a successful fragrance workshop in 1760 was determined not only by the procurement of expensive flowers and foreign fixatives, but also by the careful management of local energy resources within the urban economy of Grasse, while the delicate white blossoms of the royal jasmine captured the public imaginations and filled the pages of luxury trade ledgers. The physical survival of the laboratory depended on a far more mundane and heavy commodity, the steady supply of high-grade firewood and charcoal required to sustain the furnaces. In the middle of the 18th century, southern France faced an escalating timber crisis driven by the competing needs of shipbuilding, glass manufacturing, not so humanswacktringed, halls, and domestic heating. For a master perfumer, the acquisition of fuel represented one of the most substantial and volatile operational expenses of the summer season, demanding a precise calculation of thermal efficiency. To prevent the workshop profits from dissolving into smoke, to maintain the exact temperatures needed for rendering animal fats, and melting hardening agents like beeswax, the apprentice had to navigate a complex hierarchy of combustible materials stored within the masonry woodsheds. The primary fuel utilized for the slow, gentle heating of the copper cauldrons was seasoned olive wood, known in the local dialect as bois d'olivier, sourced from the ancient orchards that dotted the lower terraces of the valley. Olive wood was highly prized by the perfumers because it burned with a remarkably clean, consistent flame and produced an intense, enduring heat without releasing the pungent, resinous saps characteristic of cheaper pine or fir logs. Any introduction of pine smoke into the laboratory carried the immense risk of airborne contamination, as the volatile pine soot could easily settle onto the exposed fat layers of the chassis, permanently tainting the delicate canvas of the cold enfleurage base. The cost of securing a single cord of aged olive wood was tied to the strict regulations of the local forestry courts, forcing the master to contract with authorized woodcutters months in advance of the July harvest. In addition to the premium olive logs, the workshop relied heavily on charcoal, or charbon de bois, which was produced by specialized charcoal burners operating in the oak forests of the higher mountain ridges. Charcoal provided the apprentice with a source of concentrated, smokeless energy that was uniquely suited for maintaining the delicate subterranean hearths beneath the distillation stills and wax pans. The texture of individual charcoal pieces was light and brittle, leaving a persistent black dust across the apprentice's fingers and forearms as he measured out the nightly rations using a large wooden basket. This material allowed for an extraordinary level of temperature control. By carefully manipulating the iron dampers of the furnace and banking the embers with layers of grey ash, the apprentice could maintain a perfectly uniform, low-intensity heat for hours at a time, ensuring that the ingredients never reached a boiling point that would denature the delicate organic compounds. The management of this internal heat economy required an endless display of vigilance and physical endurance throughout the long night watch. The apprentice had to constantly monitor the colour and behaviour of the coals, adding small handfuls of fuel at precise intervals to prevent any sudden fluctuations in temperature. The soft, shifting glow of the vistas cast warm patterns of light across the slate floor, while the faint, metallic scent of heated copper and the dry aroma of charred oak filled the enclosed room. Every log burned and every basket of charcoal consumed was factored into the daily production costs, a reminder that the creation of elite luxury was an industrial process deeply bound to the raw resources of the earth and the careful, exhausting discipline of human hands. As the deep night hours progressed toward the early watch of the morning, the mechanical focus of the apprentice shifted the meticulous removal of spent materials, a technical phase known in the workshops of Grasse as defleurage. Every 24 hours, the vertical towers of oak chassis had to be completely dismantled, frame by frame, to manage the expiration of the botanical life cycle. The jasmine blossoms that had been scattered across the clean white fat the previous evening had, by now, completed their respiratory functions, surrendering their entire reserve of volatile essential oils to the receptive lipid matrix beneath them. These spent flowers appeared visibly altered under the dim light of the tallow candle, their once brilliant white petals having turned translucent, flaccid, and slightly golden as their cellular moisture dissipated into the sealed microclimate of the wooden frame, leaving these expired blooms on the grease for any longer than the mandatory 24-hour cycles was strictly forbidden by guild statutes, as the decaying plant tissue would begin to rot, introducing moisture and unwanted vegetable acids that would ruin the pristine canvas of the fat base. The execution of defleurage required an extraordinary amount of physical patience and tactile sensitivity from the young apprentice. Working with a small, flat wooden tool or utilizing his own fingertips with light, practiced movements, the apprentice had to remove every single spent blossom from the surface of the fat without tearing the underlying grease layer. Also, any rough or careless movement that gouged or scraped the smooth white ointment would disrupt the uniformity of the base, creating crevices where air could become trapped and trigger localized rancidity. The spent petals were gathered into small heaps and deposited into large willow baskets, creating a soft rustling sound that punctuated the profound quiet of the stone laboratory. Although these flowers were now exhausted of their primary luxury value, they still retained a faint, residual aroma, and they would later be subjected to a secondary warm washing process to produce lower-grade scented waters for the domestic market, ensuring that nothing was wasted within the strict economy of the workshop. The true mastery of the cold enfleurage technique lay in the endless repetition of this cycle of introduction and removal, a process designed to achieve absolute scent saturation within the fat base, to produce the highly prized choice pomade demanded by the elite merchants of Paris. A single layer of grease had to be treated with fresh flowers up to 36 times over the course of the summer harvest season. Each daily repetition of removing the old blossoms and immediately replacing them with a fresh midnight harvest allowed the lipid chains to absorb a new concentrated wave of benzyl acetate and other essential compounds. With each successive flower change, the white ointment grew heavier and more saturated with the pure essence of the royal jasmine, gradually transforming its physical character from a plain animal fat into a highly valuable aromatic concentrate. This relentless accumulation of scent required weeks of unyielding discipline, where the apprentice lived in a passage of time not by the calendar, measuring the passage of time not by the but by the number of times he had cleared and reladen the crystalline panes of the oak chassis. Once the intensive cycle of daily flower changes reached its zenith, after weeks of continuous labour, the material on the glass frames ceased to be regarded as a mere mixture of pork lard and beef tallow. It had undergone a complete chemical and economic transformation, attaining a new state of existence, known in the French luxury trade as pomade or highly saturated scented pomade. This intermediate product was no longer pristine white, but had absorbed a faint, translucent golden hue from the thousands of jasmine blossoms that had rested upon its surface over the course of the season, where the physical texture of the grease had also shifted, becoming remarkably dense, smooth, and entirely permeated by the complex organic compounds of the royal jasmine. The substance was now a stable repository of botanical essence, a physical manifestation of time and human patience locked securely within a lipid aromas from escaping into the atmosphere. The economic value of this finished pomade was extraordinary, reflecting the immense amount of manual labour invested in its creation. A single ounce of this highly concentrated jasmine pomade was valued at a price that could easily equal several labour. For an ordinary artisan, agricultural or for the wealthy in the province of Provence and London, the purchase of a small ceramic jar of this ointment was an emblem of supreme status, but for the people of Grasse, it represented the concentrated surplus of their entire regional economy. The master perfumer perdait these precious yields under lock and key within heavily reinforced iron-bound chests in the secure storage rooms of the workshop, treating the pomade with the same reverence and security protocols usually reserved for gold bullion or precious gemstones. The apprentice, handling the silver spatula to carefully scrape the saturated pomade, felt a profound sense of gravity during this phase of the operation. Every ounce scraped away had to be accounted for on the balance scales down to the last grain, with the master watching closely from his desk to ensure that no material was left behind on the wood or glass. The collection of the pomade into large stoneware crocks marked the culmination of the cold enfleurage process, representing a successful defense against the volatile decay of nature. As the smooth, fragrant grease accumulated in the vessels, the sheer density of the fragrance became a physical presence in the room, a testament to the unyielding discipline of the night hours converted the fragile beauty of a summer field into an enduring currency of global prestige and power. This specific grade of pomade was often designated by the Guild as Pommade de 36, indicating that it had received 36 distinct changes of fresh blossoms, which was the highest standard of concentrations recognized by the trade inspectors. The high concentration ensured that completely packed with aromatic molecules, making the pomade an incredibly potent raw material for the final stage of alcohol extraction. For the apprentice, touching this substance was a reminder of the massive socio-economic gap that defined his world, as a single careless slip of his hand could destroy a product that cost more than his family could earn in a year. The monotonous scraping sound of the silver blade sliding across the flat glass panes filled the quiet laboratory, a soothing and steady rhythm that marked the successful extraction of wealth from the fleeting gifts of the summer earth. The ultimate refinement of the saturated jasmine pomade into a liquid spirit required the introduction of a critical external solvent known as the esprit de vin, or high-proof spirit of wine. This essential chemical agent could not be produced efficiently within the mountain terrain of Grasse, as the local agricultural lands were strictly reserved for the high-value cultivation of aromatic flowers rather than vast vineyards. Instead, the master perfumer relied on a well-established regional network of supply that stretched westward to the extensive viticulturals of the Languedoc province. In this neighbouring region, massive surpluses of wine were systematically processed in specialised commercial distilleries, utilising large copper pot stills to refine the raw fermented grape juice into a highly concentrated purity alcohol of over 80% volume. This potent spirit was then filled into heavy oak casks, tightly sealed with wooden bungs, and loaded onto sturdy cargo wagons for the arduous journey across the dusty roads of southern France to the gates of Grasse. The transit of these alcohol shipments was heavily regulated by the complex internal tariff systems of pre-revolutionary France, adding a significant layer of administrative bureaucracy to the perfumers' operations. As the transport wagons crossed the provincial borders between Languedoc and Provence, the cargo was subjected to rigorous inspections by royal tax collectors who calculated duties based on both volume and proof. Upon entering the municipal jurisdiction of Grasse, the casks had to pass through the city gates, where the local customs officials levied the octroi, a municipal tax on consumer goods and industrial raw materials entering the town. The master perfumer had to present signed certificates of taxation and pay these fees in silver coin, ensuring that every drop of alcohol utilised in the laboratory was fully documented under the law. For the apprentice, receiving these heavy oak barrels involved a carefully orchestrated inspection, checking the clay seals on the bungs for any signs of tampering or dilution that might have occurred during the transit through the lonely mountain passes. Once inside the laboratory, the high-proof spirit of wine was utilised to initiate the process of lavage or alcohol washing, which represented the final extraction phase of the cold Enfleurage system. The apprentice carefully transferred the saturated pomade from the stoneware crocks into large bulbous glass vessels known as dames, Janus, which were protected by a dense outer wrapping of woven wicker or straw to prevent accidental breakage. Using a silver knife, the apprentice cut the dense golden grease into small ribbons, sliding them gently through the narrow necks of the glass carboys until the vessels were partially filled. The crystal clear esprit de vin was then poured over the fat, completely submerging the grease in the liquid solvent. The sharp, clean aroma of the rectified alcohol filled the room, temporarily cutting through the heavy, sweet cloud of jasmine that had dominated the laboratory air for weeks, creating a refreshing atmosphere during the quiet hours of the morning watch. The interaction between the high-proof alcohol and the saturated pomade was an elegant demonstration of selective solubility and chemical migration. While the animal lipids composed of lard and beef tallow were completely insoluble in cold alcohol, the volatile organic compounds of the royal jasmine possessed a strong affinity for the polar solvent of the spirit of wine. Over a prolonged period of several days, the jasmine molecules much gradually detached and migrated into the surrounding liquid, dissolving seamlessly into the alcohol. To facilitate this molecular transfer, the apprentice had to execute a demanding routine of mechanical agitation, lifting the heavy glass carboys rhythmically to swirl the contents, ensuring that every surface of the shredded fat came into direct contact with the spirit. This monotonous movement of shaking the heavy vessels, repeated hour after hour in the dim candlelight formed the physical climax of the night's labour, slowly drawing the invisible soul of the flower out of its temporary animal prison and locking it into a pure, stable liquid form that would soon delight the royal courts of Europe. The separation of the aromatic spirit from the exhausted lipids marked the final mechanical threshold of the lavage process, an operation requiring immense patience and surgical cleanliness from the apprentice. After several days of rhythmic agitation within the wicker-wrapped dame's Jans, the molecular migration was complete, and the volatile jasmine essence had entirely deserted the animal fats, dissolving completely into the high-proof esprit de vie. However, before this precious liquid could be declared a finished commodity, it had to be meticulously isolated from the solid lipid remnants that floated within the carboys. The apprentice prepared the filtration station on the long oak workbench, carefully arranging a series of large ceramic funnels over clean, empty glass flagons. To ensure absolute clarity and prevent the final perfume from turning cloudy when exposed to colder temperatures, the extraction liquid underwent a multi-tiered filtration process, beginning with a primary strain through fine unbleached linen cloths to catch the large ribbons of displaced fat. Next, the liquid was passed through tightly woven wool flannel sheets, which trapped the microscopic lipid particles that had managed to slip through the initial linen fibers, before a final pass through specialized coarse filter paper removed the last vestiges of sediment. The resulting liquid, now officially designated as the extrait de Jasmine, emerged as a brilliant, crystal-clear spirit with a delicate pale amber tint, containing the pure, unadulterated olfactory soul of the royal jasmine, completely divorced from the heavy, greasy medium that had preserved it through the hot summer nights. The residual fat left behind in the linen filters was never discarded, as the strict economic discipline of the Grasse guilds recognized value in every single byproduct of the workshop. This washed grease, known technically as the corps lavé, still retained a faint, ghost-like trace of the floral scent and a perfectly neutral chemical structure. So the master perfumer packaged this secondary material into large wooden tubs, sealing them tightly for transport down to the coastal soap factories of Marseille. There, the famous savaniers would convert the washed fats into premium, scented soaps destined for domestic markets across the kingdom, ensuring that the initial investment in pork lard and beef tallow was fully amortized. Meanwhile, the apprentice watched the last drops of the golden extract fall into the glass receiver, the steady rhythmic dripping echoing softly against the cool masonry walls of the laboratory. The long journey from a moonlit field to a stable liquid masterpiece was finally reaching its brilliant conclusion, leaving the young worker exhausted but deeply grounded in the quiet, timeless triumph of his craft. With the crystal-clear flacons of extrait de jasmine safely resting on the oak workbench, the laboratory began to lose its nocturnal isolation as the first pale light of dawn filtered through the high, arched windows. The long night of physical labor was drawing to a close, yet the final preservation of the precious liquid required one last sequence of meticulous steps before the apprentice could seek rest. The master perfumer stepped forward from his ledger desk, his face etched with the exhaustion of the night, but his eyes focused sharply on the amber-tinted spirit held within the glass. He lifted a single flagon against the incoming morning light, swirling the liquid gently to inspect its absolute clarity. Any floating speck of charcoal dust, any microscopic strand of wool fibre from the filters, or any faint cloudiness caused by moisture would render the batch imperfect, reducing its value in the eyes of the demanding Parisian brokers. who expected nothing less than crystalline perfection from the Grasse workshops. Once the purity of the batch was verified, the apprentice began the delicate task of transferring the liquid into the smaller commercial vessels that would carry the fragrance to its final destinations. These small bottles, known as flacons, were blown by hand at the traditional glassworks of nearby Biot, famous for its distinct glass-making heritage that utilized local sands and clays to produce sturdy, elegant containers. Each flacon possessed a unique character, its surface bearing subtle irregularities and tiny trapped air bubbles that caught the morning light. The apprentice used a small sterling silver funnel, pouring the precious amber extract with a steady hand, ensuring that not a single drop was spilled onto the wood. The room was silent save for the soft metallic clink of the funnel against the glass necks and the concentrated breathing of the young worker, whose hands had to maintain their precision despite the heavy fatigue settling into his muscles. After hours of unyielding labour, the closure of these flacons was a critical phase in preventing the eventual evaporation of the volatile spirit during its long transit across the kingdom. The master provided specialized stoppers carved from fine-grained Iberian cork, which had been soaked in high-proof alcohol to ensure absolute sterility and flexibility. The apprentice pressed these stoppers firmly into the bottlenecks, using a small wooden mallet to tap them into a perfectly airtight seal. To provide a permanent barrier against the elements, the tops of the bottles were then dipped into a small ceramic pot of molten red charcoal ember, which was kept liquefied over a dying charcoal ember. The hot, pungent aroma of the burning resin and beeswax, mixed with the lingering sweetness of the jasmine as the wax, cooled and hardened into a glossy protective cap. Finally, the master pressed his personal iron signet ring into the soft wax, stamping the family crest onto each bottle, a legal and commercial guarantee of authenticity that would remain unbroken until the perfume reached these dressing tables of the aristocracy in Versailles. As the final seal of the signet ring cooled and hardened into an unyielding shield of crimson wax, the morning sun finally cleared the jagged peaks of the Prealps, flooding the laboratory with a bright, revealing light that chased away the last lingering shadows of the night. The transformation of the room from a secretive, midnight sanctuary of scent into a practical place of commerce was completed as the master perfumer pushed aside the inkwell and directed the apprentice toward the final task of packing the finished goods. Standing near the door were several sturdy packing crates, constructed from rough-hewn pine boards, their interiors lined with generous layers of dried mountain moss and rye straw gathered from the surrounding agricultural fields. It was the apprentice's duty to arrange the sealed flacons within these protective nests, positioning each bottle with meticulous care, to ensure that no glass surfaces could strike one another during the tumultuous journey and down the rocky mountain passes. Each layer of bottles was separated by an additional cushion of tightly packed straw, creating an impact-absorbing matrix capable of surviving the violent swaying and jarring of the heavy transport wagons. The master stood over the crates, cross-referencing each bottle with the detailed inventory entries in the livre de raison, ensuring that the total volume of extrait de Jasmine matched the strict requirements of the contract. Once the crates were filled to capacity, the apprentice hammered the wooden lids shut, using hand-forged iron nails, the sharp, echoing cracks of the mallet breaking the serene morning air and signalling the definitive conclusion of the harvest cycle's latest chapter. These sealed crates would soon be loaded onto the backs of sturdy pack mules or heavy iron-rimmed freight carriages, commencing a treacherous 3-week journey across the post roads of France toward the bustling boutiques of the Rue Saint-Honoré in Paris. With the physical labour of the night finally completed, a profound stillness sold over the stone laboratory, leaving behind only the rich, complex olfactory tapestry that clung to every porous surface of the room, the intense sweetness of the jasmine, the warm balsamic depth of the aged resins, and the faint metallic trace of the copper alembic merged into a singular, intoxicating atmosphere that defied the incoming daylight. The apprentice leaned heavily against the oak workbench, his hands stained verre kept hat, charcoal dust and residual wax, his eyes heavy with the immense physical exhaustion that came from serving as the silent vehicle for this ancient art. As the master locked the heavy iron-bound storage chests and extinguished the final oil lamp, the young worker knew that his respite would be brief. For in a few short hours, the sun would begin its descent, the sharecroppers would return for blooming jasmine, the field knocks to fresh baskets of blooming jasmine, and the relentless, beautiful dance of the elements would begin anew in the dark. Stepping through the heavy oak door of the workshop, the apprentice was met by a sudden, bracing wave of cool morning air that immediately worked to cleanse his lungs and alcohol vapours that had enveloped him for hours. Mhoned, meaning imbi. The contrast was sharp and immediate. The heavy, silent alchemy of the stone laboratory was replaced by the crisp, bright reality of a Grasse morning. The narrow cobblestone alleyway was still cast in shadow, but the upper stories of the tall limestone houses' sun were already catching the first golden rays of the sun, reflecting a warm, amber glow onto the uneven ground below. The apprentice paused on the threshold, leaning against the cold stone doorframe to allow his eyes to adjust to the natural light, feeling the gentle, persistent ache in his shoulders and forearms that served as a physical reminder of the heavy oak chassis he had lifted and balanced throughout the night watch. As he walked slowly down the steep winding path toward the lower square, the town of Grasse was gradually awakening to its daily rhythms, presenting a chaotic symphony of sights and sounds that stood in stark disciplined silence, mandated by the master perfumer. Because wooden shutters creaked open on the upper floors, and the distant, rhythmic clatter of iron-rimmed wheels on stone announced the arrival of early morning delivery wagons from the agricultural plains below. From the nearby tanneries, situated along the lower water channels, the sharp, pungent smell of curing hides drifted upward, mingling briefly with the clean, sweet aroma of wood smoke from bakeries, preparing the morning yield of coarse rye loaves. This complex urban sensory landscape was entirely familiar to the young worker. Yet after a night spent in total immersion with the royal jasmine, the everyday smells of the town felt heightened, almost overwhelming to his refined senses. The apprentice directed his steps toward a small sunlit terrace overlooking the expansive valley, where the vast tiers of agricultural fields stretched out toward the distant horizon, like a green tapestry. From this vantage point he could see the very plantations where the sharecroppers would soon begin their daytime maintenance of the jasmine bushes, pruning the branches and clearing the soil under the hot Mediterranean sun so that the flowers could synthesize a fresh reserve of volatile oils for the coming night. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small crust of hard bread, chewing it slowly as he watched the morning mist lift from the lowlands, revealing the true scale of the industrial and natural machine that sustained his world. He knew that his current exhaustion was merely a temporary pause in a theatrical dance. In a few short hours, the sun would reach its zenith and begin its descent. The blossoms would unfold their petals in the darkness, and he would once again return to the quiet sanctuary of the stone room to capture the fleeting soul of the summer harvest as Sue pleased. The walk back to the modest quarters where the apprentice spent his few hours of daily rest was a slow, sombre procession through the secondary arteries of the town, away from the wealthy facades of the master perfumers' hotels particuliers. As he moved further down the hillside, the architectural grandeur of cut ashlar limestone gave way to the weathered, timber-framed tenements inhabited by the vast workforce that sustained the luxury trade from beneath. Here, the air was never truly free of industrial remnants. The low-lying sectors of Grasse trapped the heavy acidic vapours of the tanneries and the fatty, cloying smells of the public slaughterhouses where the raw or tallows were initially harvested. This sensory overlapping was a constant reminder of the dual nature of the town, an urban landscape where the highest expressions of courtly refinement were fundamentally dependent on the most visceral and unpleasant realities of animal processing. The apprentice climbed the narrow, creaking wooden stairs to his small garret room beneath the clay-tiled roof, a space that offered little comfort beyond a simple straw pallet and a wash basin of cold water. Despite the profound physical exhaustion that weighed down his limbs, sleep did not come easily or cleanly to the young worker. When he finally closed his eyes, his subconscious mind remained trapped within the claustrophobic confines of the stone laboratory, repeating the mechanical motions of the smotzer in an endless, hallucinatory loop. In his dreams, the vertical towers of oak chassis stretched upward into infinity, their glass panes covered not in pristine white lard, but in a suffocating, shifting sea of blossoms that demanded immediate removal before they could rot and spoil the harvest. The distinct olfactory memory of the royal Jasmine was so thoroughly embedded within his olfactory receptors and his skin that he could still smell its intense, indolic sweetness cutting through the stale air of his room, blending with the dry scent of the sun-baked roof tiles above his head. This phenomenon was well known among the labourers of the guild, a state of perpetual sensory saturation, where the line between the physical world and the working environment dissolved entirely, turning the worker into a living extension of the master-s trade. By the time the afternoon sun reached its highest point, casting a fierce, baking heat across the rooftops of Provence, the apprentice was forced to win. His brief period of respite cut short by the absolute requirements of the agricultural cycle. The intense heat of the mid-July afternoon meant that the Purse laboratory for the incoming night harvest had to begin long before the first sharecroppers descended from the hillsides with their wicker baskets. He washed his face care pit, ite hat lukewarm water from the earthenware pitcher, trying to clear the lingering fog of his troubled sleep, and dressed in his coarse linen working clothes. Kep Hatiksheh still bore the faint, stubborn scent of the rectified spirit of wine from the previous morning's infiltration. Walking back up the steep stone alleys toward the workshop, he observed a noticeable shift in the energy of the town. The lazy stillness of the siesta hours was giving way to a tense, expectant hustle as the local merchants, guild inspectors, and workshop owners prepared for the most demanding phase of the summer season. The economic pressure bearing down on the workshop during these peak weeks of the harvest was immense, as any delay in processing the freshly picked blossoms would result in an immediate financial disaster for the Master S enterprise. The royal jasmine was an incredibly volatile crop that possessed no resilience against the passage of time. Mossus, once a flower was severed from the bush, its internal clock began a rapid countdown towards cellular decay, during which its volatile oil production would peak and then permanently drop within a matter of hours, sacredly. This meant that the laboratory had to function with the flawless precision of a complex mechanical timepiece, where every individual, from of them as calculating the ledger entries to the apprentice managing the charcoal hearths, had to execute their duties without a single of hesitation, without a single moment to cease. As the apprentice unlocked the heavy outer door of the stone workshop and stepped back into the cool, dim interior, the sudden transition from the blinding exterior sunlight forced him to refocus his mind entirely on the practical mechanics of the air, preparing his body for another grueling 12-hour watch in service of the French State S sensory dominance. The immediate priority upon re-entering the dim sanctuary of the laboratory was the rigorous execution of the afternoon's sanitization protocol, a grueling administrative and physical requirement that preceded every single nightly intake of the Royal Jasmine. The apprentice could not afford to allow even the slightest hint of morning residue to compromise the pristine conditions of the workspace, as the intense heat radiating from the exterior stone walls risked accelerating the fermentation of any stray organic matter left behind. Armed with a heavy bristle brush made from stiff horsehair and a bucket of boiling water drawn from the courtyard, he began the systematic scrubbing of the massive oak workbenches, some coming to the wood darkened by decades of saturation from various essential oils and animal lipids, required a delicate balance of physical force and careful precision. Scrubbing too lightly would fail to dislodge the microscopic layers of old grease, while scrubbing too aggressively might splinter the ancient timber, creating crevices where bacteria could fester and ruin future batches of pomade. As the steam from the boiling water rose into the enclosed air, it mixed with the lingering nocturnal scent of the jasmine and the sharp, medicinal undertone of the high-proof spirit of wine, creating a thick, suffocating microclimate that made respiration difficult for the young worker. Sweat pooled beneath his heavy canvas apron, dripping onto the wet slate floor as he moved from the workbenches to the critical task of inspecting the vertical towers of empty chassis. Each individual wooden frame had to be laid out horizontally across the stone drying racks, its crystalline glass pane inspected under the light of a single tallow candle for any structural imperfections or structural contamination. The apprentice passed his fingers lightly over the smooth surfaces of the lard and tallow matrix, checking for the telltale signs of daytime degradation. If the interior temperature of the laboratory had risen even a few degrees too high during the afternoon, the delicate balance of the fat blend could suffer from localized melting, causing the surface to become uneven and rendering it incapable of uniform molecular absorption. While the chassis were drying under the watchful eye of the apprentice, the master perfumer made his grand, silent entrance into the workshop, his silk coat rustling softly against the doorframe as he stepped into the humid space to conduct his daily qualitative audit. Without uttering a single word to his subordinate, the master approached the stone storage crocks containing the premium pomade de 36 that had been extracted during the previous watch. He retrieved a long, polished silver testing needle from his breast pocket, dipping it deep into the golden ointment before withdrawing it to inspect the consistency and colour of the yield. He brought the tip of the silver instrument to his nose, closing his eyes in deep concentration as he evaluated the precise balance of the top notes and the foundational anchor provided by the Tuscan orris root, looking for any discordant notes that might indicate a failure in the apprentice mechanical execution. The silence in the room during these few minutes of sensory evaluation was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of the courtyard fountain outside. and the heavy thumping of the apprentice's own heart, who stood at his eyes toward her, kept his eyes cast toward the floor, knowing that a single negative gesture from the master could result in immediate dismissal or severe guild penalties. Once the master satisfied himself with the quality of the current stock, he nodded curtly and recorded the parameters into the master ledger, his quill scratching sharply against the thick parchment pages to document the survival of the enterprise capital. He then turned his attention to the inventory of raw materials, pointing his walking stick toward the heavy masonry wood sheds, to indicate that the replenishment of the charcoal furnaces could no longer be delayed. The apprentice immediately shifted his focus to the heavy manual labour of clearing the spent ashes from the subterranean hearths beneath the copper alembic, utilising a long iron shovel to scoop out the pale grey residue into large wicker baskets. The fine ash dust rose into the air, coating his damp skin in a dark powdery film that mixed with his sweat, a visceral transformation that stripped away any illusion of luxury or courtly romance from the daily reality of the perfume trade. Every scoop of ash had to be carried out to the rear courtyard, where it was accumulated for sale to local soap boilers or agriculturalists, ensuring that the strict economic circle of the pre-revolutionary guild system was maintained down to the very waste products of the industrial process. With the hearths cleared and the fresh blocks of seasoned olive wood arranged for preparation of the laboratories, beside the furnaces, was finally reaching its zenith, leaving the workspace in a state of tense, immaculate readiness for the arrival of the next great wave of white blossoms that were currently being harvested under the fading light of the Provencal sun. The transition from the blinding heat of the afternoon to the long purple shadows of the Provencal twilight brought a distinct shift in the atmospheric pressure of the valley, signalling the imminent arrival of the day's harvest. Outside the thick masonry walls of the workshop, the sky transformed into a deep palette of indigo and amber, and the fierce Mediterranean breeze that had baked the stone streets subsided into a cool, descending mountain current. The apprentice stood near the wide double doors of the lower courtyard, his arms crossed over his damp canvas apron, listening intently to the distant collective sounds echoing up the winding mountain paths. It began as a faint rhythmic murmur, the sound of heavy wooden clogs striking the cobblestones, the high-pitched chatter of young children, and the low, exhausted conversations of women who had spent the last 12 hours bent double in the terraced fields. These were the peasant sharecroppers and day labourers returning from the vast jasmine plantations, their bodies sunburned and their hands stained green from the sticky sap of the bushes, carrying the entire economic future of the workshop upon their shoulders. As the first group of harvesters entered the stone archway of the courtyard, the physical reality of the luxury trade revealed its deep social inequalities. These workers, dressed in patched homespun linens and worn leather shoes, bore massive wicker baskets lined verkepitehat damp hemp cloths to shield the delicate white blossoms from the destructive rays of the setting sun. The apprentice immediately sprang into action, setting up the primary weighing station near the entrance under the direct, unyielding supervision of the master perfumer, who sat at a small folding table with a fresh sheet of parchment and a heavy inkwell. The centrepiece of this station was a massive brass balance scale, its chains clinking sharply in the quiet evening air as the apprentice adjusted the counterweights, ensuring that the instrument was perfectly level before the first transaction could take place. The economic tension in the courtyard was palpable. For the harvesters, the weight of their baskets determined whether their families would eat a proper meal, abyss, or face the winter in debt, while for the master, any inaccurate measurement could lead to a significant overpayment for material that might not yield the expected volume of essential oil. One by one, the harvesters stepped forward to present their yields, lifting the damp cloths to reveal the tightly packed layers of royal jasmine, which appeared like a shimmering drift of snow against the dark woven wicker of the baskets. The master perfumer did not merely accept the weight recorded on the scale. He used his long wooden cane to gently stir the top layers of the blossoms, conducting a rigorous sensory inspection to ensure that the workers had not attempted to artificially increase the weight of their cargo. It was a common deception among the desperate day labourers to secretly scatter heavy river sand, damp soil, or useless green leaves at the bottom of the baskets, or to harvest underdeveloped green buds that possessed no aromatic value. If the master discovered even a trace of such adulteration, his voice would cut through the courtyard like a whip, threatening to confiscate the entire basket without payment or banish the offending family from the guild plantations entirely. If the apprentice watched these interactions with a quiet, observant detachment, carefully lifting Jihad heavy basket onto the brass pan of the scale, sliding the iron counterweights along the notched beam, and shouting out the final numbers to the master, who recorded them with sharp, decisive strokes of his quill. Once a basket was officially weighed and approved, the apprentice carried it into the darkened interior of the laboratory, where he carefully inverted the wicker container over large, clean wicker mats laid out across the slate floor. As the thousands of tiny white blossoms fell through the air, tumbling over one another in a soft cascading wave, they released a sudden, explosive concentration of fresh aroma that instantly transformed the microclimate of the room. This was not the heavy, oily scent of the pomade or the sharp, medicinal cloud of the rectified alcohol, but the living, breathing essence of the flower at the exact moment of its nocturnal awakening. The sheer volume of the fragrance was so intense that it felt like a physical weight against the apprentice's chest, forcing him to breathe shallowly through his nose as he used a flat wooden rake to spread the blossoms into a uniform, shallow layer across the mats. This sorting process was essential to allow the surface moisture from the damp cloths to evaporate completely, before the flowers were introduced to the animal fat base, as any trapped water droplets would trigger the immediate growth of mold within the sealed meticulous labour, destroying weeks of meticulous labour in a single night. Through this endless repetition of weighing, inspecting, and spreading, the laboratory gradually filled with the white wealth of the hillsides, setting the stage for the midnight watch, where the apprentice would once again become the silent mechanic of the air. The clock on the wall of the Sunday church struck the midnight hour, its deep, bronze resonance vibrating through the thick foundation stones of the laboratory and signalling the immediate commencement of the true enfleurage process. The ambient temperature inside the stone room had dropped to the optimum level required by the guild statutes, a precise coolness that was necessary to keep the lard and tallow matrix from softening, while ensuring the fresh jasmine blossoms remained in a state of suspended animation. The apprentice moved systematically toward the first vertical tower of oak chassis, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to blur his vision. He lifted the topmost wooden frame verkepiter hat practiced ease, laying it flat across the primary workbench under the direct illumination of two braided hemp-wick tallow lamps. The light flickered across the pristine, opaque white surface of the prepared fat, which had been scraped smooth during the afternoon watch and now swaiting blemished canvas to receive its fragrant cargo for the 25th Exvotkev, sup the summer harvest to the 20 consecutive night of the summer harvest. Reaching into the large wicker baskets where the sorted dry jasmine blossoms lay spread in shallow layers, the apprentice gathered a loose handful of the white beetles, feeling their crisp, delicate textures against his calloused palms. The technique of scattering the flowers across the grease layer was a highly specialized skill that required years of repetitive muscle memory to perfect, known among the provincial artisans as the art of the strewing. It was not a matter of simply throwing the blossoms onto the pane. Instead, the apprentice had to execute a fluid, sweeping motion of his wrist that allowed the flowers to separate in mid-air and cascade downward in a perfectly uniform decentralized patterns. Each individual blossom had to land squarely on its base or its side, ensuring that the microscopic oil glands located on the exterior of the petals came into direct, unhindered contact with the receptive lipid surface below, without being buried or crushed under the weight of neighboring flowers. The spatial density of this botanical blanket was governed by strict mathematical proportions that the master perfumer monitored with unyielding scrutiny from his ledger desk. If the flowers were scattered too sparsely across the glass pane, the enormous absorbing capacity of the pork lard and beef tallow would be underutilized, resulting in a weak, diluted pomade that would fail to achieve the required concentration during the eventual alcohol extraction phase. Conversely, if the apprentice allowed the blossoms to overcrowd or pile atop one another in thick clusters, the lack of air circulation within the sealed microclimate of the chassis would trap the natural respiratory moisture of the living plants, triggering localized decay and the immediate development of vegetable mold. The ideal arrangement resembled a precise mosaic of white on white, where every single square inch of the fat layer was occupied by a single layer of open blossoms, leaving just enough microscopic space between the petals to allow the volatile benzyl acetate gases to escape upward and saturate the air pocket directly above them. As the apprentice progressed through the rows of empty frames, the physical monotony of the task became a form of waking meditation, punctuated only by the soft, rustling sound of the petals sliding from his fingers and the heavy rhythmic thud of the oak frames being stacked one atop the other. When a chassis was perfectly covered in its blanket of jasmine, he lifted a second empty frame from the reserve pile, positioning its wooden edges precisely over the perimeter of the completed pane before lowering it into place. The weight of the upper chassis served to compress the air within the lower chamber, creating an airtight seal that locked the volatile essences within a microscopic vacuum between the lower layer of fat and the upper pane of glass. This interlocking vertical tower gradually grew taller as the midnight hours wore on, transforming the laboratory into a silent forest of dark oak wood columns that held the entire aromatic wealth of the provencal summer captive within their sealed interiors. The chemical reaction taking place inside these darkened wooden enclosures was entirely invisible to the eye, yet its progression was signalled by a subtle alteration in the quality of the room's atmosphere. The living jasmine blossoms, though severed from their parent bushes, continued to carry out their nocturnal metabolic functions for several hours. After being placed on the grease, exuding their precious essential oils as a defense mechanism against the artificial drought of the laboratory environment, the long carbon chains of the animal lipids acted as a highly efficient molecular sponge, drawing the volatile fragrance molecules out of the air and binding them permanently to the fat molecules through weak intermolecular forces. The apprentice could feel the density of the air changing around him, the sharp raw greenness of the fresh flowers gradually giving way to a deep, heavy, and almost intoxicating sweetness that seemed to penetrate his clothing and settle into the very pores of his skin, a permanent reminder of the absolute submission of nature to the rigorous discipline of human industry. By the time the church bells tolled for the 3 o'clock watch, the vertical towers of oak chassis had grown to their maximum height, standing like a fleet of dark monoliths against the damp stone walls of the laboratory. The apprentice's fingers were numb, coated in a sticky film of botanical resin and natural wax that had transferred from the thousands of jasmine stems he had handled since midnight. His lower back throbbed with a dull, persistent ache from the constant lifting and positioning of the heavy wooden frames, yet the mechanics of the watch permitted no deviation from the established schedule. He moved away from the finished towers toward the secondary preparation area, where the maintenance of the auxiliary materials required his immediate, focused attention before the first signs of dawn began to alter the atmospheric pressure of the valley. The focus of this late-night phase was the stabilization of the Workshop S iron-rimmed storage crocks, which held the aging pomades from the previous weeks of the harvest. These large stoneware vessels, imported from the ceramic kilns of Valoris, were critical to the preservation of the Workshop S intermediate capital, acting as permanent safeguards against the entry of ambient moisture or destructive insects. The apprentice used a heavy wooden mallet to check the tightness of the willow hoops surrounding the lids of a sheer hat crock, listening for any hollow or loose tones that might indicate a failure in the structural integrity of the containers. A single microscopic gap in the seal would allow the volatile aroma compounds to slowly bleed out into the room, reducing the ultimate yield of the extrait de jasmine and resulting in a severe financial deficit that the master would undoubtedly deduct from the apprentice. Meagre seasonal allowance. While performing these structural checks, the apprentice had to simultaneously monitor the behavior of the small charcoal furnaces pans in the corner of the laboratory. Beltin. These hearths, which burned the highly concentrated charbon de bois prepared in the high mountain oak forests, had to be maintained at a very low, smokeless simmer to prevent any sudden fluctuations in the room's ambient temperature. The apprentice used a long pair of iron tongs, banking them with thin layers of grey ash to dampen the intensity of the flame while preserving the core thermal energy. This delicate manipulation of the internal heat economy was essential. If the room became too cold, the animal lipids on the glacively brittle lose their elasticity, whereas if the temperature rose even slightly above the optimum standard, the grease would begin to sweat, releasing volatile short-chain fatty acids that would permanently taint the delicate floral canvas with a rancid, animalic undertone. The master perfumer remained seated at his elevated desk, his silhouette silhouetted against the flickering glow of a single beeswax candle. As his quill continued its rhythmic, scratching journey across the pages of the master inventory ledger, he spoke no words of encouragement to the young worker, choosing instead to maintain the absolute social distance that defined the hierarchy of the 18th century guild system. To the master, the apprentice was not a student to be nurtured, but an essential, replaceable piece of operational machinery whose physical labour was required to convert in gifts of the provencal earth, citoespest, stable, globally tradable currency of elite prestige. The soft scraping sound of the silver spatula slicing through experimental batches of fat, and the only acoustic markers of the passage of time were Goli acoustic go, creating a heavy hypnotic soundscape that seemed to expand the dimensions of the enclosed stone laboratory until the outside world ceased to exist entirely. As the clock crept past the 4 o'clock watch, entering that freezing liminal period where the night was at its darkest just before the first cracks of dawn, the apprentice duties shifted, away from the vertical towers of the Jasmine chassis and toward the heavy, cold metal of the distillation sector. In the northern corner of the laboratory stood the massive copper alembic, a silent, gleaming monument to the thermal arts of the guild, while the cold enfleurage of Jasmine was a passive, slow process of molecular migration. The distillation of auricle water of natural materials was an aggressive, mechanical tokel, not as an aggressive, ceased volatile operation that required immense physical strength and precise mechanical preparation. Before the sun rose and the master ordered the fires to be stoked for the morning distillation of wild rosemary and lavender harvested from the higher alpine ridges, the interior of the copper still had to be thoroughly scraped and sanitized to remove any trace of copper carbonate or verdigris, which naturally formed on the metal surfaces when exposed to the humid, acidic air of the laboratory. The apprentice hauled a heavy wooden bucket filled with a caustic mixture of crushed wood ash, coarse sea salt, and vinegar toward the base of the alembic. Kneeling on the cold slate floor, he removed the heavy, bulbous copper toe, exposing the deep, cavernous interior of the cucurbite, the lower boiling vessel. Nor the metallic odour of raw copper mixed sharply with the sour tang of the vinegar. As he leaned his upper body entirely inside the dark opening, his shoulders straining as he began to scrub the curved internal walls with a stiff bundle of dried heather twigs, the physical exertion was claustrophobic and exhausting. The rough copper surface scraped against his knuckles, and the concentrated fumes of the acidic cleaning solution made his eyes water profusely in the dim candlelight. Every square inch of the interior had to be scrubbed until the dull greenish patina gave way to the bright, salmon-pink gleam of pure, untainted copper, for if even a fraction of the verdigris remained, it would chemically react with the incoming essential oils, turning the precious distillates cloudy and imparting a harsh, metallic note that would ruin the entire batch. Once the internal scrubbing was completed to the master's silent satisfaction, the apprentice rinsed the vessel with multiple buckets of mountain water drawn from the stonewat's poured the stone conduit, watching the dark, brackish rinse water drain through the lower brass stopcock into the waste channels below. He then turned his attention to the preparation of the luting paste, or lute, a specialized sealing compound that was critical to preventing the escape of volatile aromatic steam during the high-pressure distillation process. In a small earthenware basin, the apprentice mixed equal parts of coarse rye flour, fine river clay, and linseed oil, using his bare hands to knead the dense, sticky dough until it achieved a perfectly uniform, malleable consistency. This paste would be used later to seal the joints between the cucurbite and the chapiteau, as well as the connection to the col de ying, the swan neck pipe that directed the hot vapours down into the cooling worm within the wooden condensing vat. The physical preparation of these auxiliary materials were connected the apprentice to the broader economic reality of the Grasse fragrance industry. And the comment. Redying Wolf, he knew that while the wealthy consumers in the northern courts viewed perfume as an ethereal magical fluid detached from the material world, its creation was entirely dependent on this gritty, manual interaction with metal, fire, and industrial waste. His hands were permanently stained with a mosaic of black charcoal dust, yellow beeswax, and the pale grey residue of the luting paste, a tactile record of his complete submission to the master's enterprise. As he finished wiping down the exterior of the copper, still with an oily linen cloth, the first faint, pale grey light of the pre-dawn began to touch the high windows of the laboratory, where Gauche outlining the silhouettes of the oak chassis towers, and signalling that the long, grueling midnight watch was finally drawing to its close, only to give way to the relentless demands of the daytime operations. The sky outside the high-arched windows shifted from a pale slate grey to a vibrant translucent gold as the sun climbed over the distant ridges of the Esterel Massif, bringing a definitive end to the nocturnal isolation of the laboratory. The apprentice stood beside the massive wooden condensing vat that housed the copper serpentine, the coiled cooling pipe that spiraled downward from the swan neck of the alembic. The water inside this deep wooden reservoir over the final hours of the night watch, having absorbed the residual thermal energy, poured King the preliminary steam runs to ensure that the upcoming morning distillation of wild alpine rosemary would proceed without a catastrophic loss of volatile vapours. The entire volume of this water had to be manually evacuated and replaced with fresh icy meltwater drawn directly from the town's subterranean limestone conduits. Utilising a heavy, long-handled copper ladle, the apprentice began the monotonous and back-breaking task of bailing out the heated water, transferring it into large oak buckets that sloshed heavily against his shins. They kept hat every movement, his muscles, already deeply strained from hours of lifting and balancing the oak chassis, protested against the repetitive twisting, motion required to empty the deep vat. The rising morning temperature inside the room, combined with the humidity evaporating from the open water surface, created an oppressive mist that clung to the porous stone walls and condensed into heavy droplets on the low timber beams above. The apprentice carried each heavy bucket across the wet slate grate, his leather clogs slipping slightly on the slick stones, before retracing his steps to haul fresh, bone-chilling water from the courtyard cistern. The tactile contrast between the icy water from the cistern and the intense, dry heat radiating from the brick foundations of the nearby furnace was a constant assault on the young worker's physical constitution. His hands, raw and chapped from the caustic wood ash cleaning solutions used earlier, grew completely numb as the freezing mountain water spilled over his wrists, yet he could not afford to pause or slacken his pace. The master perfumer had already risen from his elevated desk to inspect the temperature of the condensing unit, plunging his thin, pale fingers into the newly filled vat to judge its readiness by touch alone. In an era before standardized industrial instrumentation, the empirical sensitivity of the master's skin was the final arbiter of production quality, capable of detecting a variation of just a few degrees that could mean the difference between a clear aromatic hydrosol and a scorched worthless distillate. With the cooling system finally stabilized at its optimum temperature, the apprentice returned to the furnace doors, utilizing a small iron shovel to introduce the first precise logs of split oak to the rekindled embers. The dry wood caught immediately, sending a sharp, crackling roar through the masonry chimney and casting long dancing shadows across the freshly swept floor of the laboratory. The workspace was now suspended in a state of absolute equilibrium, perfectly divided between the cold, passive absorption of the Jasmine towers and the aggressive thermal extraction of the copper stills, as the first distant cries of the street vendors began to echo through the winding alleys of Grasse, signalling the official commencement of the public business day. The apprentice took his place once more at the central workbench. His body pushed past the limits of ordinary endurance, but his mind entirely focused on the relentless, unyielding machinery of the luxury trade. The heavy iron hinges of the courtyard gates groaned once more as the first daytime delivery of the morning arrived, abruptly shifting the laboratories' focus from the delicate, passive absorption of the nocturnal Jasmine to the aggressive, steam-driven mechanics of the distillation sector. Down from the high arid limestone crags of the Prealps came the mountain foragers and muleteers, their sturdy dust-coated pack animals, laden with massive burlap sacks that exuded a sharp, medicinal and fiercely camphoraceous aroma. These sacks were packed to bursting with wild rosemary and high-altitude lavender, harvested by hand at the break of dawn. From the sun-baked hardiest flora could survive, where only the hardiest flora could survive. Unlike the cultivated fragile blossoms of the valley plantations, these wild mountain herbs were tough, resinous, and deeply fibrous, requiring an entirely different set of physical and chemical protocols to surrender their valuable essential oils to the Master S enterprise. The apprentice immediately untied the rough hemp cords of the topmost sack, tilting the heavy burden forward to dump the contents onto a massive, scarred pine chopping block situated near the mouth of the furnace. A dense cloud of grey dust, dried soil, and volatile terpene vapours rose into the morning sunlight, causing the young worker to cough dryly as the intense, pine-like fragrance of the wild rosemary slammed into his senses, instantly violently overwriting the sweet, indolic remnants of the jasmine that had dominated his olfactory world for the last 12 hours. Before these woody stalks could be introduced into the cavernous maw of the copper alembic, they had to undergo a brutal process of mechanical bruising to fracture the microscopic resin ducts and peltate trichomes located on the undersides of the needle-like leaves. The apprentice hoisted a heavy iron-bound wooden mallet, his sore muscles screaming in protest as he brought the tool down repeatedly onto the green masses, the rhythmic, deafening thuds echoing off the masonry walls and shattering the last vestiges of the night's serene stillness. As the herbs were crushed into a dark, sticky, and highly aromatic pulp, the apprentice shoveled the material into the lower boiling chamber of the copper, still packing the cucurbite with absolute precision, according to the rigid geometric laws of the guild. The packing of a distillation still was a deceitfully complex task. If the botanical mass was packed too loosely, the rising steam would simply find the paths of least resistance, forming narrow channels through the vegetation, and leaving the vast majority of the oil glands unextracted. Conversely, if the apprentice rammed the rosemary too tightly into the copper cylinder, the internal steam pressure would build to dangerous levels, risking a catastrophic explosion that could tear through the solder joints of the apparatus and scald everyone in the room with boiling acid. He used a long flat ash wood paddle to compress the layers evenly, pouring in precisely measured measures of mountain water from the stone conduit until the water level rested exactly 4 inches below the internal copper grating. With the botanical payload securely positioned, the climax of the preparation phase required the physical reassembly of the heavy apparatus, sealing of the papyri cymed. The apprentice called upon the final reserves of his physical strength to lift the bulbous copper still head, the chapiteau hoisting it. Hatigoga hat above his shoulders and lowering it carefully onto the rim of the boiling vessel, ensuring that the heavy metal flanges aligned perfectly without catching his bruised fingers. He then reached for the sticky grey luting paste he had kneaded during the dark hours of the morning watch, pulling off thick ribbons of the dense dough, made of rye flour, river, clay, and linseed oil. Working with rapid, frantic movements before the escalating heat of the furnace could bake the compound prematurely, he smeared and pressed the paste into the circular seam where the two massive copper components met, creating a thick, airtight collar. This primitive yet incredibly effective chemical seal was the only barrier, preventing the high-pressure ceiling rafters from escaping into the ceiling rafters, locking the invisible wealth of the mountains within the dark, boiling stomach fire below, as the roaring oak fire pile began to bring the water to a furious internal. The arrival of the final week of August brought a subtle but irreversible of the valley, signalling that the exhausting, monumental cycle of the summer harvest was finally drawing toward its grand, conclusive threshold. The fierce, unrelenting heat of the Mediterranean sun began to soften, replaced by a crisp golden autumnal light that crept across the limestone terraces of Grasse each morning, and the royal jasmine bushes began to yield their very last precious reserves of white blossoms. These late-season flowers were smaller, their petals tinged with a faint bruised purple along the edges, as the plants redirected their biological energies toward hibernation. Yet their scent had grown remarkably concentrated, heavy with an almost dark, indolic complexity that lacked the bright greenness of July, but possessed a deep carnal tenacity. For the apprentice, who had spent over 40 consecutive nights functioning as the silent, mechanical vehicle of this sensory extraction, the changing season brought both a profound sense of physical relief and the realization that the ultimate validation of his grueling labor was about to unfold, and inside the stone laboratory, the atmosphere of hurried daily production gave way to a tense, solemn period of aggregation and final quality control as the workshop prepared for the arrival of the King S, Royal Procurement Officer, and the High Jurats of the Guild of Master Perfumers. The vertical towers of oak chassis which had dominated the workspace like a dark wooden labyrinth for months were now completely dismantled, their glass panes scraped entirely clean of the golden pommade de 36. The massive stoneware crocks from Valoris had been emptied of their washed contents, and the entire wealth of the Summer S enterprise was now concentrated within 12 massive lead crystal carboys that lined the central oak workbench. Each carboy was filled to the shoulder with the pristine, pale amber extrait de jasmine, a liquid so clear and vibrant that it seemed to capture and refract the morning sunlight, casting dancing patterns of golden light across the ancient masonry walls. This was the physical manifestation of hundreds of thousands of individual hand-picked flowers, millions of hours of cellular, plant respiration, and the absolute unyielding discipline of human hands that had worked through the dark, cold hours of the night watches. The master perfumer paced before the workbench with a rare nervous energy, his fine silk coat rustling in the quiet room as he checked the wax seals on each carboy for the third time that morning. The economic stakes of this final inspection were absolute. If the Royal Procurement Officer detected even the slightest imperfection, a faint cloudiness from improper filtration, a metallic note from a poorly scoured copper alembic, or a trace of smoke from an improperly banked charcoal furnace, the entire shipment destined for the royal court at Versailles could be summarily rejected, plunging the workshop into immediate bankruptcy. The apprentice stood a few paces behind his master, his hands tucked beneath his stained canvas apron, his skin permanently marked by the mosaic of yellow beeswax, black charcoal dust, and silver nitrate stains that served as the unofficial uniform of his trade. He looked at the glowing amber liquid within the crystal vessels, and felt a strange, detached sense of ownership, though he would never wear this perfume, though his family would never earn enough in a lifetime to purchase a single flaken of this extract. His own life force had been poured into its creation, his muscles and senses acting as the indispensable forge where this luxury was hammered out of the raw earth. The silence of the laboratory was broken by the sharp echoing clatter of iron-shod hooves and heavy carriage wheels entering the cobblestone courtyard outside, announcing the arrival of the royal delegation. The apprentice immediately stepped forward to throw open the heavy oak doors, bowing low as the Juratzend stepped out of the morning light and into the cool, fragrant shadow of the workshop, dressed in elaborate embroidered velvet coats and wearing towering, powdered wigs that contrasted sharply with the gritty, industrial reality of the stone laboratory. The inspectors approached the workbench with an air of clinical, aristocratic detachment. The master perfumer bowed with obsequious grace, presenting his silver testing needles and the master inventory ledger, while the apprentice stood ready in the background with the linen cloths and the sealing wax. Knowing that the final curtain was about to rise on the long, beautiful, and brutal drama of the harvest season, the royal procurement officers stepped closer to the primary workbench, the heavy velvet of his crimson coat brushing against the scarred oak timber, as he adjusted a gold-rimmed monocle to peer into the depths of the first lead crystal carboy. The silence within the stone laboratory became so absolute, ticking of the master brass pocket watch sounded like the rhythmic striking of an anvil, with a slow, deliberate movement that carried the immense weight of the French court's absolute authority. The officer unsealed the velvet testing instruments containing his own personal testing instruments, retrieving a long, slender glass pipette, blown with surgical precision. He dipped the instrument into the pale amber liquid, drawing up a fractional quantity of the extrait de Jasmine before releasing a single, perfect drop onto a square of pristine, unbleached Flemish lace. He waved the fabric through the air 3 times to allow the volatile, high-proof Copen spirit to flash off, leaving only the pure, unadulterated concentrate of the night-blooming blossoms trapped within the delicate threads. The master perfumer stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat, his hands trembling slightly beneath his lace cuffs as the officer brought the handkerchief to his nose and closed his eyes. For several agonizing minutes, the royal representative remained perfectly still, his refined senses dissecting the complex molecular architecture of the fragrance, searching for the slightest hint of localized rancidity, the faint metallic tang of a poorly scoured copper alembic, or the rough green sharpness of premature harvesting. The 2 guild jurats watched his expression with calculating intensity, ready to validate or condemn the batch based on the slightest twitch of the officer's brow. Then a slow, genuine expression of aristocratic awe broke through the inspector's practiced mask of indifference. He opened his eyes, looked directly at the 12 carboys shimmering in the autumn sunlight, and gave a single decisive nod of supreme satisfaction. It was the absolute validation of 36 cycles of unyielding midnight labour, a liquid masterpiece free of any defect, possessing a carnal, majestic depth that would soon define the sensory landscape of the salons of Versailles. With the official approval granted, the laboratory transformed into a scene of precise bureaucratic triumph stepped forward to sign the royal contract. As his quill scratching across the heavy vellum documents that secured his family economic dominance for another generation, the apprentice immediately went to work, assisting the royal guards in transferring the crystal carboys into specialized, leather-padded transport cases lined with deep mountain moss to insulate the precious liquid against the violent shocks of the long journey to Paris. As the heavy oak crates were hammered shut and sealed with the royal lilies in golden wax, the apprentice felt an overwhelming wave of physical wash over his battered body. His muscles were torn from weeks of lifting the heavy chassis, his lungs were raw from the caustic wood ash and alcohol vapours, and his skin was permanently stained with the grey soot of the furnaces. Yet looking at the departing carriage, he knew he had achieved something monumental. He had survived the brutal, beautiful furnace of the Grasse guild system, transforming from a clumsy novice into a silent master of the air. As the dust settled in the courtyard and the rumble of the royal carriage wafted into the distance, the master perfumer returned to the quiet laboratory, placing a single heavy silver chez coin onto the workbench before the apprentice, a meagre financial pittance that represented his seasonal wage, yet a gesture that carried the unspoken respect of one artisan to another. The apprentice picked up the cold metal. Looking around the now empty immaculate room where the vertical towers of oak chassis sat stacked in neat, dormant rows, waiting for the winter snows to pass, before the cycle would demand their return, he walked out onto the stone terrace one last time, the cool autumn wind blowing down from the alpine ridges, and carrying away the last lingering traces of the jasmine scent from his hair. Looking down at the vast resting valley of Provence, he stretched his scarred, calloused fingers into the crisp morning air, knowing that while the courts of Europe would wear the luxury he had forged in the dark, the true, invisible kingdom of the scent belonged entirely to him. 2 decades later, the alpine winds of late November bare l'hiver kept just as fiercely through the high limestone streets of Grasse, rattling the heavy wooden shutters of the very same workshop that had once bore witness to the long midnight vigils of the royal jasmine harvest. The old master perfumer had long since passed away, his name carved into a modest marble headstone in the cemetery of Saint-Denis. But the laboratory itself remained entirely unchanged, preserved like a secular temple dedicated to the immutable laws of fluid extraction. Standing before the central oak workbench, which was now even more deeply scarred and stained with the dark, residual rings of amber resins and rectified spirits, was the former apprentice. His hair was now flecked vert capite, hat grey at the temples, and his face bore the sharp, meditative lines of a man who had spent a lifetime decoding the invisible architecture of the air, recognised throughout the province as a master of the guild. The world outside the stone walls was shifting beneath the weight of political upheaval and the distant rumblings of a revolution that were the ancient guild systems of the Kaimanska, rumbling systemed, if the ancien régime. Yet inside the laboratory, the physical mechanics of the craft retained their timeless absolute sovereignty. The massive copper alembic stood in the northern corner, its metallic flanks polished to a bright salmon-pink gleam that reflected the flickering light of a fresh oak fire crackling within the subterranean hearths. Beside the furnace stood a young bauble, barely 14 years old, his hands covered in the pale grey film of a freshly kneaded luting paste, as he struggled to align the heavy copper flanges of the still head. The new master watched the boy's clumsy, hesitant movements from his elevated ledger desk, observing the exact same mixture of physical exhaustion and anxious determination that had defined his own youth in this very room. Halt! Instead of issuing a sharp, biting reprimand, the master stepped down from his desk, his leather boots clicking softly against the wet slate floor. He reached out with his calloused, silver nitrate-stained fingers, gently taking the heavy iron tongs from the boy's hands to show him the precise method of banking the charcoal embers to maintain an even, smokeless simmer, the tactile memory of the cold chassis, the intense, indoclix sweetness of the royal jasmine, and the rhythmic dripping of the golden extrate into the lead crystal carboys flooded his mind, a vivid sensory tapestry that 30 years of repetitive labour had failed to dim. He realised then that the true inheritance of his craft was not the wealth recorded in the leather-bound ledgers or the royal warrants stamped in crimson wax, but this unbroken chain of human muscle memory and empirical devotion that passed from one generation to the next. The master returned to the high windows, looking out over the vast terraced valley of Provence, where the dormant jasmine bushes lay beneath a light dusting of winter frost, gathering their strength in the frozen earth for the inevitable return of the summer sun. The royal courts of Versailles might crumble, the economic structures of the kingdom might rewrite themselves in the fires of political change, but the flowers would still bloom in the dark, and there would always be a need for silent mechanics of the air to capture their fleeting souls. He turned back to the young apprentice, who was now scrubbing the copper interior with a renewed disciplined focus, the steady, rhythmic scraping of the wire brush echoing softly against the cool stone walls, marking the quiet, unyielding continuations of an endless, beautiful dance with the elements.